The wind that tore through the town of Bitter Creek in the late winter of 1878 did not just chill the skin. It seemed to seek out the marrow of the bone. It rattled the loose boards of the boardwalks and whipped the tails of the few horses tethered along the main street, turning the frozen mud into a treacherous, uneven landscape of ruts and jagged peaks. Clara stood inside the general store, the heavy warmth of the pot-belly stove doing little to stop the trembling in her hands. She was 23 years old, though the hollows beneath her eyes and the sharpness of her cheekbones made her look a decade older. Her coat was a faded gray wool, worn thin at the elbows and hem, and she clutched a threadbare shawl tight against her chest as if it could hold her shattering dignity together. Across the scarred oak counter, Silas Vance, the store owner, leaned forward. He was a thick-set man with a face that always appeared greasy. His eyes narrowed as he tapped a thick finger against the open ledger. "I have told you, Mrs. Bishop," Silas said, his voice loud enough to carry to the two women pretending to inspect a bolt of calico near the window. "The credit is gone, dry. You are already over $4.50. Clara flinched at the number. $4 might as well have been 4,000. "I just need a small sack of flour and perhaps a tin of coffee," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. "I have some sewing work promised to Mrs. Miller next week. I can pay you then. Please, Mr. Vance," Silas laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Promises. Your husband paid in promises too, and look where that left me. He died owing me $20, and I have yet to see a penny of it." The mention of her husband made Clara's stomach turn over. Even 6 months in the grave, Thomas Bishop still held her throat in his grip. From the corner of the store, "Mrs." Higgins whispered to her companion, the sound hissing through the air like steam. "Asking for credit again, as if she has not shamed herself enough. They say she went to the saloon back in October, begging for coins from the drovers." "No better than a saloon girl," the other woman agreed, her tone dripping with righteous judgment. Clara heard them. She always heard them. The heat flushed up her neck, burning despite the cold draft leaking in from the door. She had gone to the saloon. Yes, but only to ask the owner if he needed a scrub woman. She had been turned away with a lewd suggestion that sent her running into the alley, retching. But the town had written its own story, one where she was a fallen woman rather than a desperate one. Silas leaned closer, the smell of stale tobacco clinging to his mustache. He lowered his voice, though the malice remained. "Now, there are ways to work off a debt. Clara, a woman in your position, alone. You have commodities other than coins." He let his gaze drop to her chest, then back to her eyes, a smirk curling his lip. The implication hit her like a physical blow. The room seemed to tilt. Clara gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. "No," she breathed. "Then get out," Silas snapped, straightening up and slamming the ledger shut. "And if you do not have that $4.50 by the end of the week, I will come to that room of yours and take whatever is left in it, even if it is just the bed you sleep on." Clara turned and fled, the bell above the door clattering violently as she shoved her way out into the biting wind. The air outside was a shock, stealing the breath from her lungs. Dust and grit, kicked up by the gusts, stung her face. She kept her head down, staring at her broken boots. The leather was cracked, and the sole of the left one was separating, letting the icy slush seep into her stocking. She walked quickly, hugging the wall of the livery stable, trying to make herself invisible. 2 cowboys leaned against a support post, smoking hand-rolled cigarettes. As she passed, one nudged the other. "There goes the widow Bishop," he murmured. "Skinny thing, ain't she? Looking at her, you'd think she'd break if you touched her. Maybe she likes it rough." The other chuckled. "Her man sure thought so." Clara stumbled, her foot catching on a frozen ridge of mud. The memory assaulted her without permission, the sound of the front door slamming late at night, the heavy, uneven footsteps of Thomas stumbling into the dark house. She remembered the smell of cheap whiskey and sweat, the terrifying weight of him pinning her to the mattress, his rough beard scratching her face as she stared at a crack in the ceiling. praying for him to pass out. "Just lie still," she told herself, the old mantra echoing in her mind. "If you lie still, it ends faster." She remembered the pain, always the pain, and the terror of the night she went into labor 3 years ago. Thomas had been too drunk to fetch the doctor. She had birthed their son alone on blood-soaked sheets, screaming into a pillow so the neighbors would not hear. The baby had been blue and silent, a perfect, tiny thing that never took a breath. Thomas had looked at the small bundle the next morning and asked why she hadn't made him coffee yet. A sob caught in her throat, but she swallowed it down. Crying was a luxury she could not afford. It took energy, and she had none left. She stepped off the boardwalk to cross the street, the wind whipping her skirt around her legs. The dust swirled in a blinding cloud, obscuring her vision. She did not hear the heavy rumble of wheels until the shout rang out. "Whoa! Hold up!" A massive shape loomed out of the dust, a pair of dark horses and the tall wheel of a buckboard wagon. Clara froze, her muscles locking up in pure panic. She stood paralyzed in the mud, staring up at the hooves that were seconds from striking her down. The horses reared back, their iron shoes sparking against a stone. As the driver hauled on the reins with powerful hands, the wagon skidded sideways, mud spraying, and came to a halt only 3 feet from where she stood, heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Clara gasped for air. The man on the wagon seat did not yell. He did not curse her for being a fool as the townspeople would have. He simply wrapped the reins around the brake lever and stepped down. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that strained the fabric of his heavy shearling coat. His hat was pulled low, but beneath the brim, his eyes were the color of slate, gray and unreadable. He wore fine leather gloves and boots that, while muddy, were of a quality Clara had not seen in years. The street had gone quiet. A few people stopped to watch. This was Ethan Caldwell. Everyone knew Ethan Caldwell. He owned the Iron Creek Ranch, the largest spread of land in the territory, stretching from the river all the way to the foothills. He was a man of immense wealth and even immense silence, rumored to be ruthless in business and cold in heart. Ethan approached her slowly, as one might approach a spooked colt. He stopped a polite distance away, towering over her. "Mrs. Bishop," he said. His voice was deep, a baritone that seemed to vibrate in the cold air. It was not unkind, but it carried an authority that made Clara want to shrink into the ground. She looked up, her eyes wide and terrified. I'm sorry, Mr. Caldwell. The dust. I did not see." Ethan looked at her. He took in the gray face, the trembling lips, the coat that was far too thin for the weather. He recognized her. Of course. He remembered Thomas Bishop, a man who bought cattle he could not afford and beat his horses when they could not pull the load. Ethan had once intervened when he saw Thomas striking a mare outside the saloon, and Thomas had snarled that a man could do what he liked with his own property. Ethan knew he had likely applied the same logic to his wife. "Are you injured?" Ethan asked. "No," Clara said quickly, stepping back. "No, I am fine." Ethan frowned slightly. He saw the way she held her arm, protective and tight against her ribs. He took a half step forward, his hand lifting instinctively as if to steady her. "You are shaking," he noted, as his gloved hand hovered near her elbow. Clara flinched violently. Her body reacted before her mind could stop it. A sharp intake of breath, a rigid stiffening of her spine, her eyes darting for an escape route. Ethan stopped instantly. He saw the raw terror in her gaze, not the fear of a wagon accident, but the fear of a man's touch. He slowly lowered his hand to his side. "I am not going to hurt you," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "I have to go," Clara stammered. I have to go home." "Mrs. Bishop," Ethan said, his tone serious. "The wind is turning. There is a storm coming down from the north. Do you have enough fuel?" The question was practical, absurdly mundane for a man of his station to ask a pauper, but it threw her. She looked at his clean coat, the solid strength of him, and felt a wave of bitter shame. "I am fine, Mr. Caldwell," she lied. her voice brittle as dry glass. "Thank you for not running me down. Good day." She turned and hurried away, her boots slipping in the mud, desperate to put distance between herself and his penetrating gray eyes. Ethan stood by his wagon, watching her retreat. He ignored the nod of the banker walking past him. He watched until Clara Bishop disappeared around the corner of the livery stable, looking like a ghost that the wind might simply blow away. That night, the temperature plummeted 20 degrees in the span of 2 hours. Clara sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the room she rented above the livery stable. It was a small, slanted space under the eaves, smelling of hay and horse manure from the stalls below. The wind howled around the building, whistling through the gaps in the clapboards. She had 3 sticks of firewood left. 3. She placed one in the small iron stove, watching the flame lick at the dry bark. It would burn for perhaps an hour. Then she would have to decide whether to freeze now or freeze later. A heavy fist pounded on her door. Clara jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. "Mrs. Bishop!" It was the landlord, Mr. O'Malley. She moved to the door and opened a crack. O'Malley stood there, a lantern in his hand, his face red from drink. "It is freezing in here," he grunted, pushing the door open wider despite her resistance. "You are wasting heat if you don't keep that stove fed." "I am managing," Clara said, clutching her shawl. "Managing?" he scoffed. "Silas Vance tells me you have no money. My rent is due on Friday. $2. I will have it." Clara lied again. It was becoming a habit, these small, desperate falsehoods. "If you do not have it by noon on Friday, you are out," O'Malley said, pointing a thick finger at her. "I have a driver coming through next week who will pay cash. I am running a business, not a charity ward for widows who are too proud to work on their backs." He slammed the door, leaving her in the dim light. Clara sank to the floor, burying her face in her hands. The cruelty of the town felt heavier than the snow that was beginning to pile up against the window pane. By midnight, the fire was dead. Clara put on every piece of clothing she owned, 2 dresses, 3 pairs of stockings, and her coat, and huddled under the thin, scratchy blanket. She could see her breath in the air. She squeezed her eyes shut and tried to sleep, but the cold gnawed at her toes and fingers, a relentless, aching presence. 5 miles outside of town, the Iron Creek Ranch was a fortress against the storm. The main house was a sprawling structure of timber and stone, built to withstand the harsh prairie elements. In the study, a large fire roared in the stone hearth, casting a warm, orange glow over the leather armchairs and the walls lined with books. Ethan Caldwell sat at his heavy oak desk, reviewing a stack of cattle tallies. He held a glass of whiskey in one hand, the amber liquid catching the firelight. Across from him sat Dutch, his foreman. Dutch was a wiry man with skin like tanned leather and a mustache that drooped over his mouth. "We are going to lose a few calves if this keeps up," Dutch said, listening to the wind batter the shutters. "But the herd is mostly in the lower pasture. They should have enough shelter in the timber." Ethan nodded, making a mark on the paper. "Double the feed for the horses in the morning, and tell the boys to check the line shacks. If anyone gets stranded out there, they won't last the night." "Right," Dutch said. He hesitated, turning his hat in his hands. "Cook says he needs help in the kitchen. Says his arthritis is flaring up with the cold, and he can't lift the heavy sacks of flour anymore. And Mrs. Gable isn't coming out of town until the road's clear." "Find someone," Ethan said, not looking up. "Pay them well." "It's hard to find good help in winter," Dutch muttered. "Unless you want to scrape the bottom of the barrel. Saw you talking to that Bishop woman in town today." Ethan's hand paused. He looked up, his expression unyielding. And nothing," Dutch said quickly, sensing the shift in the air. "Just, folks say she's bad luck, say she's crazy, skittish as a wild hare and twice as useless. Wouldn't want that kind of trouble out here." Ethan set his pen down. He thought of the woman standing in the mud, her eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the horses and everything to do with the man standing before her. He remembered the bruise-like shadows under those eyes. "She is starving." "Dutch," Ethan said quietly. "She's town business. Dutch countered. Not ours. Ethan stared into the fire. Town business seems to involve kicking her while she is down. That husband of hers was a devil, Dutch admitted. But she ain't right. Boss, you saw her. She looks like she'd shatter if you looked at her crossways. We need a helper, Ethan said, effectively ending the conversation. If she asks for work, send her to me. If not, find someone else. Dutch nodded and left the room. Ethan remained alone, sipping his whiskey. The warmth of the fire felt suddenly indulgent. He thought of the thin coat Clara Bishop had been wearing. He thought of the way she had flinched. He had seen that look before. Years ago, on the face of a woman he had loved and failed. The memory was an old wound, one that had scarred over but still ached when the weather turned. He pushed the thought away, drained his glass, and listened to the wind scream. The next morning brought a white world. The snow had fallen thick and heavy, blanketing the town of Bitter Creek in silence. But the wind had not died. It had shifted, growing fiercer, whipping the snow into blinding drifts. Clara woke, or rather, rose from a sleepless stupor, stiff and aching. Her water pitcher had frozen solid. She heard the shouting before the door opened. O'Malley was arguing with someone in the hallway. Then her door burst open. "Out!" O'Malley roared. He was not drunk this morning. He was hungover and mean. "I told you! Friday! It is Friday!" "It is barely dawn," Clara pleaded, standing up, her limbs clumsy with cold. "Mr. O'Malley, look outside. I cannot go out. I have the driver downstairs right now with cash in hand." O'Malley yelled. "He wants the room now, not later. You didn't pay. You didn't stay. That is the law." He strode into the room, grabbed her small battered trunk from the foot of the bed, and marched to the door. "No!" Clara cried, lunging for it. O'Malley ignored her. He walked to the top of the outdoor stairs that led down to the alley and heaved the trunk over the railing. It crashed into the slush below, the lock springing open, spilling her few meager dresses and personal items into the snow. "Get out," he hissed, blocking the doorway. "Before I call the sheriff and tell him you're trespassing." Clara stared at him, her chest heaving. There was no mercy in his eyes, none in the town. She grabbed her shawl, wrapped it tight, and ran down the stairs. She fell to her knees in the snow, frantically gathering her belongings. Her hands were numb within seconds. She shoved her clothes back into the trunk and managed to snap the latch shut. She stood up, shivering so hard her teeth chattered. Where could she go? The store? Silas would laugh at her. The church? The Reverend was currently in the next town over for a revival. A thought took hold of her, born of panic and delirium. The Miller homestead, Mrs. Miller had mentioned sewing work. The Millers lived 6 miles south. They were kind people. If she could just get there, maybe they would let her sleep in their barn. It was a foolish, desperate thought. 6 miles in a blizzard was a death sentence, but the alternative was sitting in the alley until she froze. Clara gripped the handle of her trunk. It was heavy, dragging her arm down. She began to walk. She kept her head down, moving toward the edge of town. The wind pushed against her, trying to knock her over. As she passed the last building, the blacksmith shop, the open prairie stretched out before her, a vast, terrifying expanse of white nothingness. She stepped onto the road. 1 hour later, Clara no longer knew where the road was. The world had dissolved into a swirling vortex of white. The sky and the ground were indistinguishable. The wind roared in her ears, a deafening, physical weight. She had lost the feeling in her feet a mile back. Now, her legs felt like heavy logs that she had to drag through the knee-deep drifts. Her trunk acted as an anchor, pulling her down, but she refused to let go. It held the only thing she had left, her mother's Bible, a locket with a picture of her parents, the nightgown she had worn before Thomas had torn it. She stumbled, falling face first into the snow. The cold burned her skin like fire. "Get up," she told herself. "You have to get up." She pushed herself up, sobbing dry. Tearless sobs. She took another step, then another. The cold was creeping inward now. It was slowing her heart. Her thoughts became sluggish. She thought she saw a light in the distance, warm and yellow. Is that the Miller place? She moved toward it, drifting off the road, wandering blindly into the open pasture. She didn't feel the dip in the ground. Her foot caught on a buried sagebrush root, and she went down hard. This time, her fingers slipped from the handle of the trunk. She tried to push herself up, but her arms would not obey. The snow felt surprisingly soft against her cheek. It wasn't cold anymore. It felt like a heavy quilt. Just sleep, a voice whispered in her mind. Just lie still. If you lie still, it doesn't hurt. Clara closed her eyes. The wind howled over her, burying her darker shape beneath a relentless layer of white. Ethan Caldwell rode his black stallion, Midnight, along the fence line of the north pasture. The horse was powerful, bred for stamina, but even he was struggling in the drifts. Ethan's scarf was wrapped up to his nose, his hat pulled down tight. He had been out for 3 hours checking for strays. He had found 2 calves huddled in a ravine and had driven them toward the shelter of the tree line. He was heading back to the ranch house, eager for the fire and the whiskey. When Midnight shied, tossing his head. Easy, boy, Ethan soothed, patting the horse's neck. He looked to see what had spooked the animal. At first, he saw nothing but the endless white. Then, he spotted it. A dark, unnatural mound about 20 yards off the trail. It looked like a fallen log, or perhaps a dead calf. Ethan frowned. There were no trees here. He guided the horse closer. As he approached, the shape resolved itself. It was not a calf. It was a trunk. And beside it, half buried in the drift, was a person. Whoa! Ethan reined in and vaulted from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. He waded through the snow, his heart pounding a sudden, frantic rhythm. He reached the figure and fell to his knees. He brushed the snow away from the face. It was Clara Bishop. Her skin was the color of porcelain, her lips a terrifying shade of blue. Ice crystals clung to her eyelashes. Mrs. Bishop, Ethan shouted over the wind, shaking her shoulder. Her head lolled back, limp. She was not shivering. That was the worst sign. Ethan ripped his gloves off. He pressed his fingers to the side of her neck. For a terrible second, he felt nothing. Then, a faint, fluttery pulse against his skin. She was alive, barely. He looked back toward town. It was 5 miles away. The doctor was there. If he took her there, he could leave her at the clinic, but the road was treacherous. The clinic was often empty in storms, and he remembered the gossip. He remembered the way she had looked at him, terrified. If he brought her back to town, to the people who had clearly cast her out into this storm, she would likely die of neglect or shame. Then he looked toward his ranch. It was 2 miles closer. He had heat. He had food. He had Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, who was stranded there by the storm. But he also knew what it would mean. A single woman, a widow with a ruined reputation, living in the house of a bachelor rancher. The town would tear her apart. They would tear him apart too, though he cared little for that. Let them talk, he thought savagely. Memories of another storm, years ago, flashed in his mind. He hesitated then. He had waited for the proper time, the proper help. And because of his hesitation, there had been a funeral. He would not bury another woman because he was too worried about propriety. Ethan moved with efficient speed. He stripped off his heavy shearling coat. He lifted Clara's limp body. She weighed almost nothing, light as a bird bones, and pulled her upright. He wrapped his coat around her, buttoning it clumsily with his frozen fingers, enveloping her in his residual body heat. He left the trunk. It did not matter. He carried her to Midnight. The horse danced nervously, sensing the urgency. Ethan hoisted Clara up, balancing her across the saddle pommel, then swung himself up behind her. He pulled her back against his chest, wrapping one arm tightly around her waist to hold her in place, feeling the terrifying stillness of her body against his. "Go! Midnight! Home!" he commanded. The horse lunged forward, powering through the snow. The ride was a blur of white and cold. Ethan kept one hand on the reins and the other pressing Clara against him, trying to transfer some of his warmth into her. He tucked her face into his neck to shield her from the wind. "Stay with me," he growled into her frozen hair. "Do not you dare die on me. Clara." When the ranch house finally loomed out of the whiteout, lights glowing in the windows, Ethan felt a surge of relief so strong it nearly buckled his knees. He rode straight to the front porch, ignoring the stable. He shouted for Dutch as he slid from the saddle. Catching Clara in his arms, the front door flew open. Dutch stood there, eyes widening as he saw his boss, shivering in just his shirt and vest, holding a bundle of gray wool. "Boss, what in the hell? Get the door!" Ethan roared, his voice cracking. "And get Mrs. Gable, now!" He didn't wait for an answer. He strode up the steps and kicked the door open, carrying Clara across the threshold. The heat of the house hit them, a wall of warmth smelling of pine wood smoke and beef stew. Ethan did not stop. He carried her toward the fire in the great room, holding her tight, determined that this time he would not be too late. The awakening was slow, a gradual surfacing from a dark, heavy ocean of sleep. Clara Bishop did not open her eyes immediately. She lay still, feeling a weight upon her that was not the crushing cold she remembered, but something soft and substantial. Quilts, layers of them, smelling of cedar and dried lavender. She took a breath, expecting the razor-sharp bite of the blizzard, but the air was still and warm. Her body felt distant, a landscape of dull aches and throbbing extremities. But the violent shivering had ceased. Memory returned in jagged shards. The howling wind, the numbness creeping up her legs. They fall into the snow. Then, strong arms lifting her, the smell of wet wool and horse sweat, and a deep voice commanding her to stay alive. Panic flared in her chest. She snapped her eyes open and sat up too quickly. The room spun. She was in a bed that was not her own, in a room she did not recognize. It was small but well made, with plaster walls and a sturdy oak dresser. A fire crackled in a small hearth in the corner, casting flickering shadows against the ceiling. Heavy footsteps sounded in the hallway outside. Clara scrambled backward, pressing herself against the wooden headboard, clutching the quilt up to her chin. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Footsteps meant men. Footsteps meant demands. The door handle turned. Clara stopped breathing, but it was a woman who entered. She was broad-hipped and gray-haired, wearing a crisp apron over a dark dress, carrying a steaming tray. She stopped when she saw Clara awake and huddled against the wall. "Easy now," the woman said, her voice brisk but kind. "You are safe. You are at the Iron Creek Ranch." "The ranch?" Clara whispered. Her voice was a rasp, unused and dry. "Mr. Caldwell brought you in 2 nights ago," the woman explained, setting the tray on the bedside table. "I am Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. We were not sure you would wake up. Truth be told, you were frozen half to death." Clara stared at the steam rising from the bowl of broth. 2 nights. She had been unconscious for 2 days. "Mr. Caldwell," Clara repeated. The image of the man on the wagon came back to her, the slate-gray eyes, the sheer size of him. He found me. Found you buried in a drift like a lost calf." "Mrs.," Gable said, pouring a cup of water. "He carried you in himself. Now drink this. Your body needs fuel." Clara took the cup with shaking hands. As the water soothed her parched throat, the reality of her situation settled over her like a shroud. She was in a stranger's house. She had been stripped of her clothes. She realized with a flush that she was wearing a clean, oversized flannel nightshirt and tended to look like a child. The shame was a hot, acidic wash in her stomach. She was the beggar widow, the failure who could not even leave town without collapsing. "I have to leave," Clara said, setting the cup down with a clatter. "I cannot pay for this. I have no money." "Mrs." Gable placed a firm hand on Clara's shoulder, pushing her gently back against the pillows. "The road to town is buried under 3 feet of snow. Mrs. Bishop, even the mail rider is not getting through. You are not going anywhere until the thaw." Later that afternoon, there was a knock at the door. It was different from Mrs. Gable's bustlings, a singular, heavy rap. Clara stiffened. "Come in," she said, pulling the quilt tighter. Ethan Caldwell stepped into the room. He seemed too large for the space. The ceiling felt lower, the walls closer. He was dressed in work clothes, a heavy flannel shirt, a dark vest, and denim trousers tucked into boots. He did not come to the bedside. He stood near the door, keeping the length of the room between them, his hands clasped behind his back. "Mrs. Gable tells me you are eating," Ethan said. His voice was low, rumbling in the quiet room. "Yes," Clara said. She could not meet his eyes. She looked at the buttons of his vest. "Mr. Caldwell, I thank you for saving me." "You were foolish," he said bluntly. Clara flinched, walking out into a whiteout with nothing but a shawl and thin boots. Ethan continued, his tone devoid of anger but heavy with judgment. "That road is no place for a woman alone in winter. You could have died within a mile." "I had no choice," Clara said, her defense rising from a place of exhaustion. "My landlord, he threw my trunk into the street. I had nowhere to go." "You could have come to the ranch," Ethan said. "I have a bunkhouse full of men who manage to ask for help when they need it." "I am not a man," Clara snapped, then immediately regretted it. She shrank back, waiting for the reprisal, the raised voice that always followed her defiance with Thomas. But Ethan did not raise his voice. He merely watched her, his expression unreadable. "No, you are not, and that makes the town's treatment of you all the more shameful." Clara's throat tightened. "I have no family. Mr. Caldwell, no money. The store owner cut off my credit. I was trying to reach the Miller homestead to beg for sewing work." "The Millers are good people, but they are 6 miles south," Ethan said. "You made it 4 miles off course." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the popping of the firewood. Clara felt the weight of her debt to him. He had saved her life, fed her, and housed her. In the eyes of the world, she belonged to him now, in whatever way he chose to claim. The thought made bile rise in her throat. "I will pay you back," she said, her voice trembling. "I can work. I can scrub floors. I can mend." Ethan studied her. He saw the terror vibrating in her frame, the way she tracked his slightest movement like a cornered hare. He remembered the rumors in town, that she was loose, that she was desperate. Looking at her now, he saw only a woman who had been hunted. "I am short-handed," Ethan said slowly. "Mrs. Gable cannot manage the house alone in winter, and my cook has arthritis in his hands. I need someone to help in the kitchen, mend the tack and clothes for the hands, and perhaps help me tally the ledgers in the evenings. My handwriting is poor, and Dutch tells me you are educated." Clara looked up, surprised. "You want to hire me?" "I am offering a trade," Ethan corrected. "Room and board for the remainder of the winter. You work for your keep. When the roads clear in spring, if you wish to leave, I will provide you with a horse and enough wage to get you to the city, if that is your aim. No debts, no interest." Clara searched his face for the trap. There was always a trap. Men did not offer safety without a price. Usually one paid in the dark. "And is that all?" Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. Understanding her meaning, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "I run a cattle ranch, Mrs. Bishop, not a brothel. I expect hard work, nothing else." He saw her shoulders sag, the tension leaving her body in a rush. "I accept," she whispered. "I have no other choice." "Good," Ethan said. He turned to leave, his hand on the latch. "Rest today. You start tomorrow." The routine of the Iron Creek Ranch was a wheel that turned without ceasing, regardless of the weather. Clara found her place within the spokes of it. She rose before dawn, the floorboards freezing beneath her feet, to help the cook, an elderly man named Gus, who grunted more than he spoke. She peeled mountains of potatoes until her fingers were stained brown, rolled out biscuit dough, and stirred cauldrons of oatmeal that bubbled like volcanic mud. The ranch hands ate at a long wooden table in the main hall. There were 12 of them, men with wind-burned faces and hands calloused like rawhide. They were loud, smelling of tobacco and wet leather. The first time Clara walked into the hall to refill the coffee pot, the conversation died instantly. 12 pairs of eyes turned to her. "Well now," said a man with red hair and a scar across his chin. "Looks like the boss is collecting strays again." "Prettiest stray we have had in a while," another man muttered. A dark-eyed cowboy named Slim. He looked Clara up and down with a smirk that made her skin crawl. "Heard you were offering all sorts of favors back in town to pay your rent. Ma'am, is that true?" Clara froze, the coffee pot heavy in her hand. The heat of the stove seemed a mile away. The shame was a sudden, suffocating blanket. She stared at the floor, unable to speak, her heart hammering the same frantic rhythm it had when Thomas used to mock her in front of his friends. "Shut your mouth, Slim!" "Mrs." Gable's voice whipped out from the kitchen doorway. "You are here to eat, not to gossip like a washerwoman. Just making conversation." Slim chuckled, winking at the man next to him. Clara hurried back to the kitchen, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the pot. She could hear their low laughter trailing after her. She scrubbed dishes in the basin of cold water until her knuckles were raw, scrubbing at the invisible stain of their words. "Work," she told herself. "Just work. Be invisible. If you are useful, they will let you stay. If you are quiet, they will not look at you." She did not see Ethan standing in the doorway of the dining hall, his shadow long across the floorboards. He had heard. That evening, as the men gathered to smoke on the porch, Ethan stepped out. He did not raise his voice. He merely lit a cheroot and leaned against the railing. "Slim," Ethan said. "Yeah, boss? Pack your roll." Silence fell over the group. The wind whistled through the eaves. "Boss?" Slim asked, his grin faltering. "You're done," Ethan said, his voice flat and hard as ironwood. "I do not tolerate disrespect toward anyone under my roof. Mrs. Bishop is part of the staff. You speak to her with the same respect you show Mrs. Gable, or you do not speak at all. Since you cannot seem to manage that, you can ride out in the morning. It is winter." "Ethan," Slim protested, his face reddening, "you can't turn a man out. I found Mrs. Bishop half dead in the snow because men like you thought her life was a joke," Ethan said, stepping away from the rail. He loomed over the seated men, his authority absolute. "I will not have that poison here. Anyone else who has a comment on her past can leave with him." No one spoke. They looked at their boots. Clara, listening from the cracks in the kitchen shutters, felt a strange sensation in her chest. It was not quite safe, but it was the absence of immediate danger. A man had used his strength to shield her, rather than crush her. The concept was so foreign she did not know where to place it. Weeks passed. The winter was relentless, a series of blizzards separated by days of gray, dust-laden wind that scoured the paint from the buildings. Clara worked until her back ached, but she found a strange solace in the exhaustion. It kept the memories at bay. When she wasn't cooking or cleaning, she sat in the corner of the study, mending shirts. She began to notice the land. Through the windows, the Iron Creek Ranch was a harsh masterpiece. The pastures were sweeping sheets of white, broken only by the dark lines of fences and the distant, jagged teeth of the mountains. The cottonwoods along the creek stood like skeletal fingers against the sky. It was a brutal landscape, one that could kill without malice. But there was an honesty to it. The sky was so wide it made the town feel like a cage. One morning, the wind shifted, blowing in dry and cold from the north. The snow had crusted over with ice. "We need to check the North Line shack," Ethan announced at breakfast. "We are missing a count on the supplies up there, and I need to see if the roof held up under that last snow." He looked across the room to where Clara was stacking plates. "Mrs. Bishop, I need you to come. I need the inventory tallied and written down properly. And as I said, my writing is poor." Clara dropped a fork. It clattered loudly against the wood. "Me? It is a 2-hour ride," Ethan said. "We will be back before supper." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her chest. To be alone with him. Miles from the house, miles from Mrs. Gable. She remembered Thomas taking her for a drive in the buggy, out to the edge of the reservoir. He was smiling then, but when they were far enough away that no one could hear a scream, the smile had vanished. "You think you are better than me. Clara, you think you can hide things?" I have bread rising," Clara stammered, wiping her hands on her apron. "I cannot leave." Ethan watched her. He saw the way her eyes dilated, the way she unconsciously backed toward the wall. He realized his mistake. He had thought of her as an employee, forgetting she was a wounded animal. He paused, adjusting his hat. "Actually," he said smoothly, "Mrs. Gable needs to check the pantry stores at the shack as well. We will take the wagon. It will be slower, but we can bring back any hides the boys left up there." He looked at Clara. "If Mrs. Gable comes, can you manage the tally?" Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The presence of the housekeeper changed everything. It was a buffer, a witness. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I can do that." Ethan nodded once and turned away, but Clara saw the tension in his jaw. He had seen her fear, and instead of mocking it, he had accommodated it. The ride to the line shack was a journey into the heart of solitude. Clara sat in the back of the wagon with Mrs. Gable, wrapped in buffalo robes, while Ethan drove the team. The west stretched out around them, indifferent and vast. The ground was hard as iron, glazed with ice that cracked under the wagon wheels. In the distance, buzzards circled in a slow, lazy spiral over something dead in a ravine. A coyote, perhaps, or a calf that had strayed. Clara watched the birds. It was so easy to disappear out here. A person could fall, and the snow would cover them, and by spring, they would be nothing but bones and leather. It terrified her, yet there was freedom in it too. No one watched you here. The wind did not whisper gossip. They arrived at the shack, a rough timber cabin half buried in a snowdrift, while Mrs. Gable busied herself checking the tins of coffee and beans in the corner. Ethan and Clara worked at the small table. Ethan called out numbers from the shelves, and Clara wrote them in the ledger, her handwriting neat and looping. The cabin was small. The air was thick with dust and the smell of dry pine. 3 boxes of cartridges, Ethan said, reaching for a high shelf, and 2 coils of rope. He turned to hand her the ledger he had moved. "Here, check the date on this one." He stepped closer to hand it to her. The space was tight. As he reached out, the cuff of his heavy coat brushed against her wrist. It was nothing touching, a graze of wool against skin, but for Clara, it was a trigger pulled. A jolt of electricity shot through her arm. The memory of Thomas grabbing her wrist, the bruising grip, the twist that forced her to her knees, flashed before her eyes with blinding clarity. Clara gasped, a sharp, strangled sound. She jerked her hand back as if burned. The ledger slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a loud thud. She scrambled backward, her chair screeching against the wood floor, until her back hit the log wall. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving, her eyes wide and unseeing. "No," she whimpered. I didn't mean to." Mrs. Gable dropped a tin of beans. Ethan froze. He held his hands up, palms open, showing he held nothing. He did not move toward her. He stayed perfectly still, like a statue carved from granite. "Clara," he said softly. It was the first time he had used her given name. "I am not him." Clara blinked, the room slowly coming back into focus. She saw the dust motes dancing in the shaft of sunlight. She saw Mrs. Gable looking at her with pity. She saw Ethan, standing 6 feet away, his face pale beneath his tan. She slid down the wall slightly, clutching her chest. I'm sorry, you startled me." Ethan slowly lowered his hands. He crouched down to pick up the ledger, keeping his movements deliberate and slow. He placed it on the table. "He hurt you," Ethan said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a quiet fury that was not directed at her. Clara looked at her hands. They were trembling uncontrollably. "Thomas, he had a temper when he drank, and when he didn't, he did more than have a temper. Ethan said, his voice tight. He made you afraid of your own shadow. I am sorry, Clara repeated, tears stinging her eyes. I am useless to you like this. I cannot even take a book from your hand. You are not useless, Ethan said firmly, and you have nothing to apologize for. We are done here. Let us go home. He walked out of the cabin into the cold air, needing to put distance between himself and the violence he could feel radiating from her memories. He wanted to find Thomas Bishop's grave and dig him up just to kill him again. That night, the wind returned with a vengeance. It rattled the shutters of the ranch house, sounding like someone trying to pry them open. Clara lay in her bed, staring into the darkness. Her wrist tingled where Ethan's coat had brushed it, but the sensation was getting mixed up in her mind with the phantom grip of her husband. She closed her eyes, and sleep took her. But it was not a kind sleep. She was back in the house in town. The door slammed, heavy boots on the stairs. Thomas was laughing, a low, wet sound. Where are you hiding? Clara, you know I like it when you hide. She was under the bed, pressing her face into the dust. He grabbed her ankle. He dragged her out, his fingers digging into her flesh. She tried to kick, but he was too heavy. He pinned her down, his weight crushing the air from her lungs. Just lie still, he hissed, his whiskey breath hot on her face. Just lie still and take it? The pain, the tearing, the suffocation. No! Clara woke up screaming. It was a raw, primal sound that tore through the silence of the house. She sat bolt upright, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. She was drenched in sweat, clutching the blankets to her chest, gasping for air. She heard running footsteps in the hall. Ethan appeared in her doorway. He was barefoot, wearing only trousers and his shirt, which was half unbuttoned, revealing a chest covered in dark hair. His hair was tousled from sleep, his eyes alert. Clara, he called out, stepping into the room. Clara scrambled back against the headboard, her eyes wild. In the shadows, his large frame was just a silhouette. It was him. It was Thomas. Don't, she screamed, throwing a pillow at him. Don't touch me. Get out. Ethan stopped dead. He saw the terror in her posture, the way she shielded herself. He realized instantly that she did not see him. She saw a monster. He did not advance. He did not try to hush her. Slowly, deliberately, Ethan backed out of the room. He stepped into the hallway, out of her line of sight. Clara huddled in the bed, shaking, waiting for the blow, waiting for the anger. But the room remained empty. Instead, she heard a rustling sound, then a heavy sigh. Ethan had sat down on the floor in the hallway, leaning his back against the wall right outside her open door. I am right here. Clara, he said. His voice was calm, deep, and steady. It came through the wood and the darkness, an anchor in the storm. I am not coming in. I am sitting on the floor. I have no weapon. I am just sitting. Clara's breathing hitched. She stared at the empty doorway. Why? She whispered. Because you are scared, Ethan said. And you should not be scared alone. Silence stretched between them, but it was different now. It was not empty. I had a dream, Clara said, her voice trembling. He was here. He is dead, Ethan said firmly. He is 6 feet under the frozen ground, and he is never coming back. You are at Iron Creek. You are safe. Clara pulled her knees to her chest. I can still feel him. Sometimes, his hands. Ethan was silent for a long time. Outside, the wind howled. I have nightmares too, he said softly. Clara blinked. You? Years ago, Ethan began, speaking to the opposite wall. There was a blizzard, worse than this one. I was engaged to be married. Her name was Sarah. Clara held her breath. She had never heard him speak of this. No one in town spoke of it, other than to say he had a tragic past. She went out riding, Ethan continued, his voice rough. She was a good rider, better than me, but the storm came out of nowhere. I went out to find her. I searched for 2 days. He paused. Clara could hear the pain in the silence, fresh as a wound. I found her, he said, But I was too late. She had tried to shelter near the creek. If I had ridden east instead of west, if I had been an hour faster, it was not your fault, Clara whispered. It felt like it, Ethan said. It still feels like it. I swore then I would never let anyone I cared about depend on me again, because I failed them. Clara listened to his breathing in the hallway. She realized then that his distance, his coldness, was not arrogance. It was armor. He was just as terrified as she was, not of violence, but of loss, of his own perceived inadequacy. You found me, Clara said quietly. Yes, Ethan said. I found you. You were not too late for me. She heard him shift on the floorboards. No, I suppose I wasn't. Clara lay back down, clutching the quilt. The terror of the nightmare had receded, replaced by a strange, fragile warmth. The man sitting outside her door was not a monster. He was a guardian, keeping watch against the ghosts that haunted them both. Ethan, she whispered, I am here. Thank you. Go to sleep. Clara, I will be here until morning. And for the first time in years, Clara closed her eyes and slept without fear, lulled by the rhythmic breathing of the man on the other side of the wall. The grip of winter began to loosen its jaw on the Iron Creek Ranch, though it did so with a reluctance that left the land scarred and sullen. February bled into March, and the white drifts that had buried the fences receded, revealing a landscape of churning brown mud and gray, matted grass. The wind no longer carried the scent of snow, but rather the heavy, wet smell of thawing earth and rotting leaves. It was a bleak season, stripped of the brutal beauty of the whiteout, leaving only the raw, exposed bones of the prairie. Clara Bishop had become a fixture within the house, as essential and quiet as the pendulum clock ticking in the hallway. Her hands, once raw and trembling, had grown steady with the rhythm of the work. She kneaded dough with a strength she had not possessed 2 months ago, her knuckles dusting the flour across the scarred oak table. She scrubbed the floors until the wood grain shone pale and clean. She mended the heavy canvas coats of the ranch hands, her needle flashing in the lamplight. Stitching shut the tears made by barbed wire and brambles. She moved through the house like a ghost who had decided to haunt the living by making them comfortable. She spoke little, keeping her eyes lowered when the men came in for meals. But she no longer flinched when a door closed too loudly. The terror was still there, coiled tight in her belly. But she had learned to step around it. The ranch hands, rough men who usually paid little mind to domestic matters, began to notice the change in the house. But more than that, they noticed the change in the boss. Ethan Caldwell was a man who belonged in the saddle or the study, managing the sprawling logistics of his empire. Yet, in recent weeks, he had found an unusual number of reasons to be in the kitchen. One Tuesday evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and charcoals, Clara was finishing the dishes. The water in the basin was cooling, greased with the remnants of the beef stew. Ethan entered through the back door, stomping the mud from his boots. He carried a toolbox in one hand and a piece of planed oak in the other. Clara paused, her hands submerged in the water. Mr. Caldwell, is something broken? Ethan did not look at her directly. He knelt by the threshold between the kitchen and the pantry. This step, he said, his voice low. It creaked when Mrs. Gable walked on it this morning. The wood is rotting underneath. It is unsafe. Clara watched him. She had walked over that step 100 times and never heard a sound. I had not noticed. Sir. It is unsafe, he repeated firmly, prying the board loose with a hammer. He worked in silence, the muscles of his back shifting beneath his flannel shirt. Clara went back to washing, but her awareness of him was a physical pressure in the room. He was close, barely 5 feet away. She could smell the scent of him, leather, tobacco, and the crisp outdoor air. Every so often, she felt the weight of his gaze. He would pause, hammer in hand, and look toward the sink. He watched the curve of her neck as she bent over the basin, the stray wisp of hair that had escaped her pins. When she turned to dry a plate, His eyes would snap back to the wood, his jaw set in a hard line. It was not a predatory look. Clara knew what predatory looked like. She had lived with it for 3 years. This was something else. It was a look of hunger. Yes, but a hunger that seemed to be fighting itself, a longing that was laced with restraint. Mrs. Gable, entering from the dining hall with a stack of bowls, paused. She looked at Ethan on the floor, then at Clara by the sink. A small, knowing smile touched the housekeeper's lips, but she said nothing, merely setting the bowls down with a deliberate clatter that made Ethan jump. "Finished, Mr. Caldwell?" Mrs. Gable asked innocently. "Nearly," Ethan grunted, driving a nail home with a single, powerful blow. "I do not want anyone tripping while carrying a hot pot, that is all." He stood up, brushing the sawdust from his knees. He towered over the space, making the kitchen feel suddenly small. He looked at Clara, his gray eyes softening for a fraction of a second. "Good night, Mrs. Bishop." "Good night, sir," Clara whispered. He left, taking the air from the room with him. The peace of the ranch, fragile as it was, shattered 3 days later. The mud on the road to town was thick enough to suck the shoe off a horse, but the mail rider had managed to get through. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Red, brought the saddlebags into the study where Ethan was working on the ledgers with Clara. "Letter from the bank, boss," Red said, tossing the envelope onto the desk. "And there is talk in town. Ugly talk." Ethan looked up, his pen pausing. "What kind of talk?" Red shifted his weight, glancing uncomfortably at Clara, who was organizing receipts at a small side table. "About the widow, sir, and debts." Ethan ripped open the envelope. As he read, his face turned to stone. The silence in the room grew heavy, suffocating. Clara stopped her work, her hands trembling. She knew that look. That was the look Thomas used to get before the shouting started. "Red, leave us," Ethan commanded. When the door clicked shut, Ethan stood up. He walked to the window, staring out at the gray afternoon. "Clara?" She stood up, clutching her ledger against her chest like a shield. "Yes?" "This letter is from Mr. Sterling at the bank," Ethan said, not turning around. "He informs me that he has sold the outstanding debt of the late Thomas Bishop. He sold it this morning." Clara let out a shaky breath. "Sold it? To whom?" Ethan turned then. His eyes were dark with a fury she did not understand. "To Harlan Graves." The blood drained from Clara's face so fast she nearly fainted. She gripped the back of the chair to keep her knees from buckling. "Graves? The saloon owner?" "The same," Ethan said. "Why would a saloon owner buy a dead man's debt, Clara, unless he had a way to collect?" Clara closed her eyes. The memory she had tried to bury, the secret she had carried through the blizzard, clawed its way up her throat. "I signed a paper," she whispered. Ethan went very still. "What paper?" "Before the eviction," Clara cried softly, the words tumbling out. "It was October. Thomas had been dead 2 months. I had nothing. Mr. Sterling told me he would seize the furniture. I went to the saloon. I thought I could scrub floors, wash glasses." She opened her eyes, pleading with him to understand. "Mr. Graves." He laughed at me. He said he didn't need a scrub woman, but he said he would loan me $50 to keep the landlord away if I signed a contract. "What were the terms?" Ethan asked, his voice terrifyingly calm. "If I could not repay the $50 plus interest by the first day of spring." Clara sobbed. "I would work off the debt in his establishment." Under his direction, Ethan closed his eyes and exhaled a long, sharp breath through his nose. He knew Harlan Graves. He knew the man's reputation. Graves didn't hire waitresses. He enslaved women. He used the law as a trap, binding desperate women with contracts that compounded interest faster than they could earn, ensuring they never left his upstairs rooms. "I thought I could get sewing work," Clara wept. "I thought I could pay it back. I was so hungry. Ethan, I was so cold." She used his given name without realizing it. Ethan crossed the room in 2 long strides. For a moment, Clara flinched, expecting a blow, but he stopped a foot away. His hands clenched at his sides, fighting the urge to destroy something. "He bought the bank debt to add to his own claim," Ethan said, his voice grinding like gravel. "He holds the mortgage on your life, Clara, and the first day of spring is next week." "I have to leave," Clara gasped, turning toward the door. "I cannot bring this on you. He will come here. He will drag me back." "You are not going anywhere," Ethan snapped. "He has the law." "He has a piece of paper," Ethan corrected. "And I have a Winchester." They did not have to wait until spring. Harlan Graves was an impatient man. 2 days later, under a sky that hung low and heavy like a wet wool blanket, a wagon rolled under the archway of the Iron Creek Ranch. It was followed by 3 riders, hired guns with dusters covering their holsters. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard the dogs barking. She looked out the window and saw the wagon splashing through the yard mud. She saw the man on the seat, a heavy man in a checked suit and a bowler hat, with a face like a bulldog. Harlan Graves. Beside him sat Mr. Sterling, the banker, looking pale and nervous. Behind them, at a safe distance on the main road, a buggy and 2 other riders had paused. The town gossip. They had followed the spectacle. Eager to see the widow dragged out, Clara's heart stopped. The terror was a cold hand reaching into her chest and squeezing. She backed away from the window, her hands flying to her mouth. "Mrs. Gable," she choked out. The housekeeper looked out the window and cursed, a word Clara had never heard a woman use. "Stay here, child?" "No." Ethan's voice came from the hallway. He walked into the kitchen, wearing his gun belt. He looked at Clara. His face was hard, stripped of all emotion, a mask of pure resolve. "Come with me," he said. "I can't," Clara whispered, shaking her head. "Please, don't make me face him." "You will not face him alone," Ethan said. "But you must stand. If you hide, they win. Stand behind me." He held out a hand. He did not touch her, but he offered the space. Clara looked at his hand, then at the window. She remembered the alley behind the saloon, Graves pinning her against the brick wall, his wet mouth near her ear as he whispered about how pretty she would look in red silk. She took a breath that shuddered through her entire frame. She stepped forward, not taking his hand, but walking in his shadow. They walked out onto the front porch. The wind whipped Clara's skirt around her legs. The mud of the yard was a churned mess of hoof prints. Ethan stood at the top of the stairs, his thumbs hooked in his belt, near the handle of his revolver. The ranch hands had gathered from the barn and the bunkhouse. They stood in a loose semicircle, pitchforks and hammers in hand, their faces grim. They didn't like the look of the hired guns. "Mr. Caldwell," Harlan Graves called out, climbing down from the wagon. His boots sank into the muck. He smiled, revealing yellowed teeth. "Fine day, isn't it? Bit wet, but spring is coming." "State your business." "Graves," Ethan said. "And then get off my land." Graves chuckled, adjusting his cuffs. "Hostile. I expected as much. I am here for my property." "Caldwell, I have no cattle of yours," Ethan said. "Not cattle," Graves said, his eyes sliding past Ethan to fix on Clara. The widow Bishop." Clara shrank behind Ethan's broad back, gripping the fabric of his coat. Graves pulled a folded document from his breast pocket. "I have a contract here, signed by Clara Bishop, dated October 14th. She owes a sum of $250. That includes the bank debt I purchased and the interest. The contract stipulates that in lieu of payment, she is to enter my employment immediately. Labor contract. Mr. Sterling squeaked from the wagon seat. "Perfectly legal. It is indentured servitude," Ethan said. "It is slavery by another name." "It is the law," Graves snapped, his smile vanishing. "She signed it. She took my money. Now she pays. You have been harboring her. Caldwell. Some might say you have been enjoying the goods before I got to sell them. But her time is up. Hand her over." The ranch hands muttered angrily. Slim, the man Ethan had fired, was gone. But the others had grown protective of the quiet woman who mended their shirts. "She is not going with you," Ethan said. Then I will have the sheriff out here, Graves threatened. And I will have you arrested for interference with a legal debt. Do you want that scandal, Ethan? Do you want the whole territory knowing you are keeping a whore in your house? Clara let out a sob. The shame was burning her alive. The men on the road were watching. The ranch hands were listening. She was ruined. Ethan felt her trembling against his back. He looked at the paper in Graves's hand. He knew the law. In this territory. A debt contract was ironclad. If he fought this with guns, he would be an outlaw. If he fought it in court, Graves would bribe the judge. And in the meantime, Clara would be held in the town jail, or worse, in Graves's custody. He needed a higher law. He needed a shield that Graves could not penetrate. He looked at the saloon owner, and a cold clarity settled over him. "The contract is for Clara Bishop?" Ethan asked. "That is right," Graves said. "And it claims her labor for a debt. Every hour of it." "Then you have a problem," Ethan said, his voice ringing out across the yard. "Because you cannot enforce a labor contract against a woman who is under the legal protection of her husband." Silence slammed into the yard. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Graves blinked. "Husband? She ain't got a husband. He's dead." Ethan reached back and took Clara's hand. His grip was hard, unyielding. He pulled her forward to stand beside him. She looked up at him, eyes wide with shock. "She is my fiancée," Ethan announced. The lie, no, the promise, hung in the cold air. "We are to be married this week. As my wife, her debts become my debts, and I will settle the financial sum with the bank directly. But as for her person, she belongs to no one but herself, and she resides under my protection." Graves's face turned a mottled purple. "You are lying. She is a stray you picked up in a snowbank." "Careful," Ethan warned, his hand dropping to his gun. "You are speaking of my future wife. I will take this to the circuit judge," Graves roared, shaking the paper. "I will prove this is a sham. She is a swindler, and you are a fool." "Bring the judge," Ethan challenged. "Judge Holloway's a stickler for family law. I wonder what he will think of a saloon keeper trying to solicit a rancher's betrothed." Graves looked at Ethan, then at the grim line of ranch hands, then at the gun on Ethan's hip. He realized he had lost the moment. He spat into the mud. "You will pay the $250, Graves hissed. "And I will make sure everyone in this territory knows exactly what kind of woman you married. A $2 whore who tricked a rich man." "Get out," Ethan said. Graves scrambled back into the wagon. He whipped the horses violently, turning the wagon in a spray of mud. The entourage retreated, the gossip mongers on the road hurrying away to spread the scandalous news. Clara stood frozen on the porch. She could not feel her legs. She looked at the ranch hands. Some were grinning, slapping each other on the back. Others were whispering, looking at her with a new, sharp speculation. "Gold digger." Their eyes seemed to say, "Schemer." Ethan did not look at the men. He turned to Clara. "Inside, now." In the study, Ethan slammed the door and locked it. He walked to the liquor cabinet and poured himself a glass of whiskey, his hands shaking slightly. He downed it in one swallow. Clara stood in the center of the room, hugging herself. "What have you done?" she whispered. Ethan turned, bracing his hands on the desk. "I bought us time. That is what I did. You told them. You said—" "I said we were to be married," Ethan said. "And we must be by the end of the week." Clara recoiled as if he had struck her. "Married? Ethan, you cannot mean it. You did that to make him leave." "He will be back," Ethan said, pacing the rug. "He is going to Judge Holloway. If you are Clara Bishop, widow and debtor, Holloway might side with Graves just to keep the peace in town. But if you are Clara Caldwell, wife of the largest landowner in the county, Holloway won't touch you. The law protects a wife. It does not protect a woman alone." "I cannot marry you," Clara cried. "Look at me. Ethan, I am a beggar. I am damaged. The whole town thinks I am—" "What he said I was." "I do not care what the town thinks," Ethan said fiercely. "But I care," Clara shouted, her voice breaking. "I care that I would trap you. You have a life. You have a name. If you marry me, you drag all my filth into your house. "The house is big enough," Ethan said. He stopped pacing and looked at her. The anger drained out of him, leaving only a heavy, weary sadness. He thought of Sarah. He thought of the vow he had made to never let himself love again, to never be responsible for another heart. But looking at Clara, her thin frame shaking, her eyes terrified, he realized he had already broken that vow the moment he lifted her out of the snow. He was already responsible. "Clara," he said, his voice softening. "Sit down." She sank into the leather armchair, looking small and lost. Ethan pulled a chair opposite her. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I am not offering you a romance. I know you are not ready for that. Maybe you never will be. And I am not a man who is easy to be with. I carry my own ghosts." Clara looked at him, tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. "But I can offer you safety," Ethan said. "Real safety. Not just a lock on the door, a name, a legal standing. If you marry me, graves cannot touch you. No man can ever force you to sign anything again." Clara's breath hitched. Safety. It was the one thing she had craved for 3 years. But the cost. "A marriage," she whispered, her face flushing scarlet. "A marriage means duties, expectations." She could not say the words. The bed, the dark, the weight. Ethan understood. He saw the panic flaring in her eyes. "No," he said firmly. Clara looked up. "I want to be clear," Ethan said, holding her gaze. "I'm asking for your hand in partnership. I need someone to help run this house. You need protection. That is the bargain." He took a deep breath, forcing himself to speak the next words. "I will not touch you, Clara, not in that way, not unless you ask me to. You have my word. You will have your own room. I will not force a husband's rights upon you." Clara searched his face. She looked for the lie. Thomas had promised he wouldn't hurt her, too, but Ethan's gray eyes were steady. There was a hardness in them. Yes, but it was the hardness of stone, not cruelty. Dependable. "You want a family," Clara said softly. "I heard you speak Dutch once. You want children." Ethan looked away, a muscle ticking in his jaw. "I want a lot of things I cannot have. I want to not have failed Sarah. I want to undo the past. But we live in the present, and in the present. I cannot let them drag you to that saloon." Clara looked down at her hands. They were red from the dishwater, scarred from the cold. She weighed her life. On one side, the certainty of Harlan graves, rape, degradation, a slow death in a room above a bar. On the other side, this silent, imposing man who had saved her life, who fixed loose steps so she wouldn't trip, who stood between her and the wolves. He was asking her to trust him with her life. But more terrified than that, he was asking her to trust him with her body, even if he promised not to touch it. The proximity alone was a risk. But she remembered the way he had sat in the hallway that night. "I am just sitting. I have no weapon." "You promise?" she whispered. "You promise you will be patient? That you won't become him?" Ethan reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm, engulfing her cold fingers. "I would cut off my own hand before I used it to hurt you." Clara took a breath. The air in the room felt charged, heavy with the storm that was passing and the new one that was beginning. "Okay," she said. The word was barely a sound. "Okay, I will marry you." Ethan squeezed her hand once, then released it. He stood up, looking exhausted, but relieved. "Good," he said. "I will send it to the preacher tomorrow." He turned to the window to hide his face, because for a moment, when she had said yes, a flicker of something hot and bright had sparked in his chest. It wasn't just relief, it was a desire, a profound, terrifying desire to be not just her protector, but her husband in truth. He shoved the feeling down, locking it away in the same dark box where he kept his guilt. He had given his word. He would keep her safe, even if it meant living with a hunger that would never be fed. "Go rest, Clara," he said gruffly. "We have a lot to do." Clara stood and walked to the door. She paused, looking back at his rigid back. "Ethan." "Yes?" "Thank you." She slipped out. Ethan stayed at the window, watching the mud dry in the yard, wondering if he had just saved them both, or damned them to a hell of longing they wouldn't be able to escape. The wedding of Ethan Caldwell and Clara Bishop took place on a Tuesday morning under a sky the color of a bruised plum. The clouds hung low and heavy over Bitter Creek, threatening a sleet that had not yet decided to fall. It was not a day for celebration, it was a day for business, and the air in the small wooden church felt as cold as the frozen mud in the street outside. There were no flowers. The pews were largely empty, save for a strange, mismatched congregation. Dutch, the foreman, sat near the front, holding his hat in his lap and looking uncomfortable in a stiff collar. Mrs. Gable sat beside him, wearing her Sunday best and a look of defiant pride, daring anyone to whisper. A handful of ranch hands stood at the back, their boots scraping softly against the floorboards, witnessing the union of their boss to the woman they had once mocked. Clara stood at the altar, her hands trembling so violently that the small bouquet of dried sage and winter berries shook. She wore a simple dress of pale blue wool that Mrs. Gable had hastily altered to fit her slender frame. It was modest, high-necked, and clean, but Clara felt naked. She could feel the eyes of the town upon her back. Though the church was not full, the doors had been left open, and a small crowd of curious onlookers had gathered on the steps and the boardwalk. Mrs. Higgins was there, whispering behind her hand to the baker's wife. Their eyes bored into Clara, filled with a mixture of envy and disgust. The widow who trapped the rich man. Their eyes said, the woman with the ruined name, the Reverend, a thin man with spectacles who seemed anxious to get the ceremony over with, cleared his throat. Do you, Clara Bishop, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Clara's breath hitched. The word stuck in her throat like a dry crust. She looked at the Reverend's shoes. She remembered another altar, another man standing beside her, Thomas, smelling of bay rum and promise. He had vowed to cherish her. Within a month, he had blackened her eye because the roast was dry. Saying it, she commanded herself. Say it, or Harlan Graves takes you. Her voice failed. Beside her, Ethan moved. He did not step away. He stepped closer. His large, warm hand covered her freezing fingers, engulfing them completely. He squeezed, not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough to ground her. It was a tether. I do, she whispered. And do you, Ethan Caldwell? Ethan's voice rang out clear and steady, a baritone that seemed to push back the chill in the room. I do. When he slid the ring onto her finger, a thick band of gold that felt heavy, like a shackle made of sunlight, Clara felt a tear slip down her cheek. It was done. She was safe. She was trapped. They walked out of the church into the biting wind. As they descended the steps to the waiting buggy, a voice called out from across the street. Harlan Graves stood in the doorway of his saloon. He held a glass of whiskey aloft, his face flushed and mocking. To the happy couple, Graves shouted, his voice carrying over the wind. May the nights be long and the debts be paid, though I reckon you paid a high price for damaged goods. Caldwell? A ripple of snickers went through the crowd on the boardwalk. Clara flinched, ducking her head. Ethan stopped. He handed Clara into the buggy, tucking the buffalo robe around her legs with deliberate care. Then he turned slowly to face the saloon. He did not shout. He did not draw his gun. He simply looked at Harlan Graves with a gaze so cold and dismissing that the saloon owner's grin faltered. Ethan stared until the silence stretched thin, until Graves lowered his glass and retreated into the shadows of his bar. Ethan climbed into the buggy and took the reins. Walk on, he murmured to the horses as they rolled out of town, the wheels crunching on the frozen ruts. Clara looked down at her hand. The gold ring caught the weak light. It was a shield against the world, but as she looked at Ethan's profile, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the road, she wondered if she had simply traded a wolf for a bear. The Iron Creek Ranch was quiet when they returned. The hands dispersed to their chores, leaving the newlyweds alone in the main house. That night, the wind picked up, whistling around the corners of the stone foundation. The house was warm. The fires banked high, but Clara felt a chill that went bone deep. She stood in the center of the master bedroom. It was a large room, dominated by a massive four-poster bed carved from dark walnut. It looked like a ship in a harbor, vast and imposing. Her small trunk had been moved in, sitting forlornly at the foot of the bed. Ethan was lighting the oil lamp on the dresser. He turned the wick down low, casting the room in a soft, amber glow. He had removed his coat and tie, and the informality of his shirt sleeves made Clara's heart hammer against her ribs. "Clara," he said, turning to face her. She jumped slightly. "Yes?" Ethan looked at the bed, then at her. He saw the way she stood, rigid, arms wrapped around herself, eyes darting to the door. "I meant what I said," Ethan said quietly. "I will not touch you." "I know," Clara breathed. "But this is your room, your bed." "It is our room now," Ethan corrected. "But it is a big bed. There is plenty of space." He walked over to a heavy leather armchair near the fireplace. He picked up a quilt from the back of it. "If you prefer, I can sleep here tonight. Or in the bunkhouse. But the bunkhouse is cold. And Mrs. Gable would have questions if the groom slept in the barn on his wedding night." Clara looked at the chair. It looked uncomfortable and small for a man of his size. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. He had saved her life. He had married her to save her honor, and now she was banishing him to a chair because she was too broken to lie beside him. "No," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "No, Ethan, you need to sleep. You have work in the morning." "Clara, the bed is big enough," she interrupted, forcing herself to walk toward it. "I will stay on my side. You stay on yours." They prepared for bed in a stilted, agonizing silence. Ethan turned his back while she changed into her nightgown, hurrying to bury herself under the heavy quilts. She lay on the far edge of the mattress, staring at the wall, pulling the covers up to her chin. She felt the mattress dip as Ethan lay down on the other side. He did not get under the quilts. He lay on top of them, wrapping himself in a separate woolen blanket. He blew out the lamp. Darkness swallowed the room. "Good night, Clara," his voice came from the dark, deep and rough. "Good night," she whispered. She lay awake for hours. She listened to the wind. She listened to the steady, rhythmic breathing of the man beside her. He was so close. If she reached out her hand, she would touch his shoulder. The heat from his body radiated across the space between them. Conflicting emotions swirled in her chest like a dust devil. She was relieved. Yes, the terror of the act, the weight, the pain, the invasion, was not to be faced tonight. But beneath the relief was a strange, stinging hurt. "He does not want to touch me," she thought. "I am so damaged, so thin and scarred, that it is easy for him to keep his promise." It was a foolish thought. She had begged for this distance. But the shame of being unwanted sat heavy in her stomach, warring with the fear of being taken. She fell asleep eventually, curled into a tight ball, guarding herself against a threat that never came. In the weeks that followed, the strange new rhythm of their life began to settle. Clara was no longer the charity case. She was Mrs. Ethan Caldwell. The change in her status was subtle but profound. When she walked into the dining hall, the men stood up until she was seated. They took off their hats. They called her ma'am with a deference that was genuine. Even the ones who had smirked before now looked at her with a wary respect. Perhaps because they feared Ethan, or perhaps because she carried herself differently now. Mrs. Gable became less of a supervisor and more of a mentor. "You need to know the books," the housekeeper said one morning, slapping a heavy ledger onto the kitchen table. "Ethan can run the herds, but he forgets to order flour until we are down to the last sack, and he pays too much for grain." Clara took to the task with a desperation to be useful. She found she had a head for numbers. She organized the pantry inventory, found a cheaper supplier for coffee in the city, and began to track the calving rates in a way that made sense. One evening, Ethan came in from the cold, smelling of snow and horses. He stood by the fire, warming his hands. while Clara sat at his desk. "We are low on fencing wire," he muttered. "I need to send a wagon to the depot." "We have 3 spools in the shed behind the barn," Clara said without looking up from her writing. "I counted them yesterday, and the price of wire has gone up 10 cents a roll, so we should wait until next month to order more if we can." Ethan turned to look at her. He stared for a moment, a look of surprise crossing his face. Then, a slow nod. "You counted the shed?" "I did," Clara said. "It was a mess." "I imagine it was," Ethan said, a corner of his mouth lifted. Not quite a smile, but close. "Thank you, Clara." That small moment of approval warmed her more than the fire. It gave her something she hadn't had since her father died, a purpose. She was not just a mouth to feed. She was a partner. The nights, however, remained a landscape of tension. Ethan continued to sleep on top of the covers for the first week, then eventually moved under them. But he kept a distinct distance. A valley of cold sheets separated them. Then came the thunderstorm. It was late April. The spring storms on the prairie were violent things, shaking the earth. It started after midnight, a crashing boom that rattled the window panes in their frames. Clara was asleep, but the sound tore her from her dreams. In the dark, the thunder sounded exactly like a heavy oak door being slammed shut by a furious hand. Wham! "No!" Clara whimpered, curling in on herself. Wham! She was back in the small house in town. Thomas was drunk. He was breaking things. He was coming up the stairs. She began to shake. A high, keen sound escaped her throat, a sound of pure, distilled terror. Ethan woke instantly. He heard the whimper, felt the bed shaking with her tremors. "Clara, don't come in," she gasped, lost in the flashback. "I'll be quiet. I promise I'll be quiet." Ethan understood. He sat up, his heart breaking for her. The lightning flashed, illuminating the room in a stark, white glare. He saw her pressed against the headboard, her eyes squeezed shut, her hands covering her ears. He moved slowly. He did not grab her. He shifted his weight across the mattress until he was near her. "Clara," he said, pitching his voice low, under the sound of the thunder. "It is the storm. It is just thunder. You are safe." She didn't seem to hear him. She was hyperventilating. "Clara," he said again. "May I hold you?" She didn't answer, just sobbed. "I am going to put my arm over you," Ethan said clearly. "Just to ground you. Tell me if you want me to stop." He waited a beat, then slowly laid his heavy arm across her shaking body, over the quilt. He did not pull her to him. He just let the weight of his arm rest there, a solid bar of warmth and presence. Clara froze at the contact, but the weight was not angry. It was not grabbing. It was heavy, stable, and still. It felt like the earth itself was holding her down, keeping her from flying apart. "Breathe," Ethan whispered, his face inches from her hair. "I have you. Nothing is getting in here." Slowly, the shaking subsided. Clara focused on the weight of his arm. It wasn't trapping her. It was shielding her. She opened her eyes and saw the outline of his shoulder in the dark. "Ethan," she whispered. "I'm here." She shifted, turning slightly toward him. She did not pull away. She nodded against the pillow. "Okay." He kept his arm there all night. He did not move to touch her further. And for the first time, Clara fell asleep feeling not just safe, but cherished. The storm broke the winter's back. May brought green grass and wildflowers that carpeted the hills in purple and yellow. With the weather clearing, Ethan decided it was time Clara learned to ride properly. "You cannot live on a ranch and be footbound," he told her. He saddled a mare named Bess, a gentle, older horse with a soft mouth. He brought them to the corral on a Saturday afternoon. Clara was nervous. Thomas had never let her ride. He said horses were for men and that she would ruin the animal's mouth. "Up you go," Ethan said, standing beside the stirrup. He put his hands on her waist to help her lift. Clara gasped. His hands were large, his fingers splaying over the fabric of her dress. Warm and firm. Through the layers of cotton and corset, she felt the heat of his palms. She swung her leg over, flushing pink. Ethan adjusted her stirrups, his hands brushing her ankle, her calf. He was focused on the tack, but Clara was focused on him. She looked down at the top of his head. His hat was pushed back. She saw the dusting of gray at his temples. She noticed, for the first time, the way the sleeves of his shirt were rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms that were corded with muscle and dusted with dark hair. When he mounted his own horse and rode beside her, instructing her on how to hold the reins, she found herself distracted. He was in his element here. He controlled the massive stallion beneath him with a subtle shift of his weight, a twitch of his finger. There was a power in him that was mesmerizing. They rode out to the creek and back. The wind played with the loose strands of her hair, when she laughed at Bess snorting at a rabbit. Ethan looked at her. His gaze dropped to her smiling mouth. His eyes darkened, the pupils dilating. It was a look of raw, unmasked want. Clara's breath caught. A strange heat pooled low in her belly. It was frightening, yes, but it was also thrilling. She realized, with a jolt, that she wanted him to keep looking at her like that, emboldened by the ride, by the weeks of peace, by the growing ease between them. The dynamic in the house shifted. One evening a week later, they were in the study. The fire was dying down. Clara was reading a book. Ethan was pouring a brandy. He walked over to her chair. "Can I get you anything?" Clara looked up. "No, thank you." He didn't move away. He stood there, looking down at her. The air in the room grew thick. The memory of the ride, of his hands on her waist, hung between them. Ethan set his glass down, slowly, giving her ample time to move. He leaned down. Clara stayed still, her heart hammering. "It is okay," she told herself. "He is my husband. I trust him." He kissed her. It started soft, testing the waters. His lips were warm, tasting of brandy. Clara closed her eyes, leaning into it slightly. Ethan groaned low in his throat. The sound was primal. He deepened the kiss, his hunger breaking the leash he had kept on it for months. He leaned over her, his large frame boxing her in. His hand moved from the armrest to her leg, sliding up her thigh to pull her closer. The contact was electric, but it triggered the wrong wire. The weight of him looming over her, the hand on her thigh, grasping, the smell of alcohol on his breath. Flashback. Thomas pinning her to the chair, Thomas's hand bruising her leg. "You belong to me." Panic, cold and white-hot, exploded in Clara's brain. "No!" She screamed. She shoved him. She pushed against his chest with all her strength. Ethan stumbled back, caught off guard. Clara scrambled out of the chair, knocking the lamp on the side table. It wobbled, but didn't fall. She backed into the corner of the room, her chest heaving, her eyes wide and terrified. "Don't!" she cried. "Don't touch me!" Silence crashed into the room. Ethan stood where he had been pushed. His chest was heaving too. His face was flushed, his eyes wild with a mixture of desire and shock. Then, the realization hit him. He saw her fear. He saw the way she was looking at him, like he was a monster. Clara's panic began to recede, replaced instantly by a crushing wave of shame. She saw Ethan, her protector, her husband, standing there, rejected. I am sorry," she stammered, tears spilling over. "I am sorry, Ethan. I know a wife should. I know I should let you." "Stop," Ethan said, his voice rough. "I tried," she wept. "I wanted to. But I can't. I'm broken. I'm so sorry." Ethan turned away. He gripped the edge of the mantelpiece, his knuckles turning white. A vein pulsed in his temple. He was a man of flesh and blood. He had waited. He had been patient. And for a moment, he thought she had wanted him. The rejection stung like a whip. He closed his eyes and forced himself to breathe. In, out. He remembered Thomas Bishop. He remembered the bruises he had seen on her soul. He turned back to her. His face was composed, though his eyes were incredibly sad. "You are not broken." "Clara," he said, his voice low and firm, "and you do not let me do anything. If you do not want it, it does not happen. But you are my husband, she whispered. And I am not him. Ethan said, I will not force you, ever. Do you hear me? Yes, she said. Go to bed, Clara. The distance grew after that night. It wasn't an angry silence, but a careful one. They were like two people walking on thin ice, terrified that one wrong step would plunge them back into the dark water. Ethan began to stay out later. He rode the fence lines until long after dark. Twice, he didn't come back to the house at all, sleeping in the bunkhouse, claiming they had an early start on branding. Clara lay in the big bed alone, staring at the empty pillow. She felt like she had failed a test. She had proven to him that she was exactly what the town said: damaged goods, useless as a wife. She wondered if he regretted saving her. She wondered if he was thinking of the saloon, where women knew how to be touched without screaming. The town noticed the distance, too, or rather, they invented it. Rumors began to swirl that the marriage was a sham, that they slept in separate rooms, that Ethan was miserable. 2 weeks later, Clara drove the wagon into town for supplies. She needed thread and flour. She walked into the mercantile, her head held high, though her hands were sweating in her gloves. Mrs. Higgins and Mrs. Miller were at the counter. They didn't see Clara enter. I heard she locked her door against him. Mrs. Higgins whispered loudly. Poor Ethan, trapped with a frigid little shrew. Well, what did he expect? Mrs. Miller sniffed. She trapped him for the money. She doesn't want a husband. She wants a purse. She is manipulative. That one. Played the victim to catch the biggest catch in the county. It's a sin, Mrs. Higgins agreed. Denying a husband his rights. It's unnatural. Clara stood frozen in the aisle. The words cut through her like knives. Frigid, manipulative, unnatural. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and stinging. She turned and ran out of the store, abandoning her list. She hurried to the wagon, climbing up and hiding her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. She felt stripped bare. They were right. In their own cruel way, they were right. She was denying him. She was a burden. Clara? Ethan's voice. He had ridden into town to meet her and load the heavy sacks. He rode up to the wagon, seeing her hunched form. He dismounted in a second, his boots hitting the dirt hard. Clara, what is it? He reached up, touching her arm. Are you hurt? Clara shook her head, unable to speak. She pointed vaguely toward the store. Ethan looked at the mercantile. He saw Mrs. Higgins and Mrs. Miller standing in the doorway, watching with a malicious glee. His face darkened. The temperature around him seemed to drop 20 degrees. Stay here, he commanded softly. He walked toward the women. He did not rush. He moved with the slow, inevitable momentum of a landslide. The woman stopped smiling as he approached. Mr. Caldwell. Mrs. Higgins twittered nervously. We were just... I know what you were doing, Ethan said. His voice was not loud, but it carried down the street. You were gossiping about my wife. We only express concern. Mrs. Miller tried to say, You are malicious harpies. Ethan cut her off. Now listen to me. You, Mrs. Higgins, your husband owes the bank for his thresher, and you, Mrs. Miller, your son works on the Henderson ranch. Does he not? The women went pale. If I hear one more word spoken against Clara, Ethan said, his voice like a blade, I will buy your husband's note from the bank and call it in the next day, and I will tell Henderson he can choose between keeping your son or selling his beef to me. You wouldn't, Mrs. Higgins gasped. Try me, Ethan said. Clara is my wife. You will treat her with respect, or you will find out just how ruthless I can be. Good day, ladies. He turned his back on them and walked back to the wagon. Clara had heard every word. She stared at him as he climbed up beside her and took the reins. He was shaking with suppressed rage. He had threatened to ruin people for her. He had claimed her, publicly and fiercely, not because of a debt contract, but because she was his. Ethan, she whispered. He looked at her. The anger in his eyes faded, replaced by concern. Let's go home, Clara. Clara nodded, wiping her tears. A mix of emotions swirled in her chest, gratitude so deep it ached, and a fresh, sharp guilt. He defended her with everything he had, and she still couldn't give him the one thing he asked for. But as she looked at his hands on the reins, steady, capable, dangerous to others but gentle with her, she knew that the wall inside her was beginning to crack, not from fear, but from the sheer force of his loyalty. Spring arrived in the high country not as a gentle awakening, but as a violent upheaval. The snow did not simply melt. It surrendered to a biting wind that tore down from the mountains, turning the frozen drifts into torrential creeks and the hard-packed roads into quagmires of sucking mud. Yet, beneath the brutality of the weather, life insisted on pushing through. Purple crocus blooms stabbed through the crust of the earth, and the bawling of newborn calves echoed against the canyon walls. The Iron Creek Ranch was a hive of desperate activity. The calving season had come early and hard. Coinciding with the late freeze, Ethan Caldwell was rarely in the house. He rode out before dawn. His coat collar turned up against the sleet and returned long after dark, smelling of wet wool, blood, and exhaustion. Clara watched him from the kitchen window, her heart beating a strange, anxious rhythm. She kept a pot of coffee hot on the stove at all hours, knowing he would need it. On a Tuesday morning, the wind was particularly vicious, carrying a stinging grit that rattled the window panes. Clara was kneading dough, her arms dusted with flour, when a shout rose from the yard. It was not the usual call of a ranch hand moving cattle. It was a frantic, high-pitched yell. Help! Get the door! Clara froze. She wiped her hands on her apron and ran to the front hallway. Through the glass of the front door, she saw a sight that stopped her breath. Dutch and another hand, a burly man named Caleb, were carrying a heavy shape between them. Ethan? His hat was gone. His head lolled back against Dutch's shoulder, and a dark, glistening streak of crimson ran from his hairline down over his eye, dripping onto his collar. Clara threw the door open, heedless of the cold wind that blasted into the hall. "What happened?" she cried, her voice trembling. "Thrown!" Dutch grunted, struggling under Ethan's dead weight. He was trying to rope a heifer in the mud. The horse slipped and went down hard, rolled right over him. "Bring him in," Clara commanded, stepping back. "To the bedroom, now!" She did not wait for them. She turned and ran to the kitchen, grabbing a basin and the kettle from the stove. She stripped the clean linens from the warming rack. Her feet were bare, but she did not feel the cold floorboards. She felt only a singular, icy focus. By the time she reached the bedroom, the men had laid Ethan on the quilt. He was pale, his skin gray beneath the tan, and he was not moving. The blood looked shockingly bright against the white pillowcase. "Get the doctor," Clara said, setting the basin down. "Road is washed out at the creek crossing." "Ma'am," Caleb said, wringing his hat in his hands. "We can't get a wagon across." "Then ride a horse," Clara snapped, wringing out a cloth in the steaming water. "Go, now!" The men fled, relieved to have orders. Clara was alone with him. She sat on the edge of the bed. Her hands, which had shaken so violently on her wedding day, were suddenly steady. There was no room for fear now. "Ethan," she whispered. He did not answer. His breathing was shallow. Clara gently wiped the blood from his forehead. It was a nasty gash, jagged and deep, but as she cleaned it, she saw the skull was not depressed. She pressed her fingers to his neck, finding a pulse that was strong and steady. She unbuttoned his shirt, her fingers flying over the fastenings. His chest was bruised, a large purple welt forming over his ribs where the saddle horn or a hoof had struck him. Seeing him like this mountain of a man, usually so invincible, now broken and silent, did something to Clara. It cracked the shell she had built around herself. She touched his cheek, feeling the roughness of his stubble. She realized, with a sudden, terrifying clarity, that if he died, the safety he had built for her would crumble, but it was more than safety. She looked at his closed eyes, his strong nose, the mouth that had kissed her once and then apologized for it. "Do not leave me," she whispered, the tears finally spilling over. "Please, Ethan, you are all I have." She realized then that he was not just her protector. He was her husband, and she cared for him with a fierceness that frightened her. Ethan woke to the smell of arnica and lamp oil. His head felt as though it had been split open with an axe. He groaned, trying to shift, but a sharp pain in his ribs pinned him to the mattress. "Lie still." The voice was soft, coming from his right. Ethan forced his eyes open. The room was dim, lit only by the low glow of the bedside lamp. Clara was sitting in the armchair, pulled close to the bed. Her head was resting on her hand, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but she was watching him. "Clara?" he rasped. "You were thrown," she said quietly. She reached out and placed her hand over his on the quilt. Her skin was cool and soft. "You have a concussion, I think, and bruised ribs." Ethan blinked, trying to clear the fog. He looked at her hand covering his. She was not pulling away. She was leaning toward him, her face etched with worry. "The heifer?" he asked stupidly. Clara let out a small, wet laugh. "Dutch says the heifer is fine. You, however, are a fool for wrestling cattle in the mud." "I had to," Ethan muttered. She was breaching. "You scared me," Clara whispered. The humor vanished from her face. "When they brought you in, there was so much blood." Ethan looked at her. He saw the stains on her apron, his blood. He saw the dark circles under her eyes. She had been sitting vigil. "I'm hard to kill, Clara," he said gently. "I promised you safety. I intend to keep that promise." Clara squeezed his hand. "You cannot keep me safe if you are dead. Ethan?" A silence settled between them, but it was not the strained silence of the past weeks. It was heavy with unspoken things. Ethan felt a surge of love so powerful it nearly eclipsed the pain in his head. He wanted to pull her into the bed, to hold her, to comfort her, but he remembered the fear in her eyes the last time he had reached for her. So he lay still, letting her hand rest on his, content with the small bridge she had built, while Ethan healed. The world outside the ranch did not rest. In the back room of the Smoky Hill Saloon, Harlan Graves paced the floorboards, his cigar chewing the air. The banker, Mr. Sterling, sat at a table, looking nervous. Across from him sat Sheriff Brody, a man whose badge was tarnished and whose eyes were always looking for the next drink. "The wedding was a farce," Graves spat. "Everyone knows it. They don't sleep in the same bed. She is a debtor hiding behind a sham marriage. The law recognizes the certificate," Sterling pointed out meekly. "Judge Holloway is difficult." "Holloway is in the capital for the next 3 weeks," Graves said, turning on him with a predatory grin. "By the time he gets back, I will have my property. I hear Caldwell took a bad fall. He's bedridden, weak." "You want to raid the Iron Creek Ranch?" Sheriff Brody asked, skepticism lining his face. "Caldwell has men—" "We are not raiding," Graves corrected. "We are executing a warrant for fraud. We claim the marriage is invalid, a conspiracy to defraud a creditor. You arrest Caldwell for the fraud, and I take custody of the woman as per the original contract until the hearing." "And if they fight?" Brody asked. "Then they are resisting the law." Graves shrugged. "And you have the right to use force. I have 5 men outside who are deputized and ready. We will ride tomorrow." The day the law came to Iron Creek was unseasonably hot. The wind had shifted to the south, blowing dry and hard, carrying the taste of dust from the plains. It whipped the drying mud in the yard into hard ridges. Clara was in the bedroom, changing the bandage on Ethan's head. He was sitting up, looking pale but alert. The dizziness had mostly passed, though his ribs still ached with every breath. "I should be out there," Ethan grumbled. "Dutch say the lower fence is down." "Dutch can fix a fence," Clara said firmly, pinning the cloth. "You need to rest one more day." A shout from the porch cut her off. "Riders, coming in fast!" Ethan's head snapped up. He winced, but swung his legs over the side of the bed. "Ethan, no!" Clara protested. "Hand me my gun belt," he ordered. His voice had the old steel in it. Clara hesitated only a second before grabbing the leather belt from the dresser. She helped him buckle it, her hands shaking slightly. "Who is it?" she asked. "Trouble," Ethan said. "Stay inside. Clara." He grabbed his Winchester from the corner and walked out, moving stiffly but with purpose. Clara stood in the bedroom for a heartbeat. Stay inside. That was the rule. The women stayed inside while the men handled the danger. But she remembered the look on Harlan Graves's face. She remembered the contract. This was about her. She smoothed her apron, took a deep breath, and followed him. When she stepped onto the porch, the heat hit her like a physical blow. The yard was filled with men. Sheriff Brody sat on a roan gelding, flanked by Harlan Graves and Mr. Sterling. Behind them sat 5 men Clara did not recognize, hard-faced men with dusters and rifles resting across their saddles. Ethan stood at the top of the steps, the rifle held loosely in one hand, barrel pointing at the ground but ready. Dutch and the ranch hands had gathered, forming a line near the bunkhouse. They were outnumbered, but they looked ready to fight. "Sheriff," Ethan called out, "you are a long way from town." "Business, Mr. Caldwell," Brody said, his voice sounding thin in the wind. "Official business?" "State it," Ethan said. Graves rode forward, his horse dancing nervously. He looked triumphant. "We have a warrant for your arrest, Caldwell, for conspiracy to defraud a financial institution, and for entering into a fraudulent marriage to obstruct justice." "That is a lie," Ethan said calmly. "Is it?" Graves sneered. "Everyone knows you don't touch her. It's a paper marriage, which means the contract she signed stands. She belongs to me." He pointed a gloved finger at Clara, who had stepped out of the shadows of the doorway. "There she is," Graves laughed. "Look at her, shaking like a leaf. She knows she's caught." Ethan took a step forward, placing himself in front of Clara. "You are trespassing, Graves. And you," he looked at the sheriff, "are about to make a mistake that will cost you your badge. Hand her over." "Ethan," Sheriff Brody said, sweating, "and come quietly. We can sort this out before the judge next month." "Next month?" Ethan laughed darkly. "You think I don't know what happens to her in a month of Graves's custody? She would be dead or wishing she was—" "She's a whore anyway," Graves shouted, losing patience. "She signed the paper. She was ready to sell it in the alley before you swooped in. Once you are in a cell, she will learn her place. She will work off every cent on her back." The vulgarity hung in the hot air. The ranch hands shifted, hands hovering over pistols. Clara stood behind Ethan. She heard the slur. She felt the familiar, suffocating wave of shame. But then, she looked at Ethan's back. He was hurt. He was barely standing upright, fighting his own pain to shield her. And something inside Clara Bishop finally snapped. The fear, which had been a cold stone in her gut for years, suddenly heated until it was molten. It was no longer terror. It was rage. Pure, white-hot rage. She stepped out from behind Ethan. "Clara, get back!" Ethan hissed. "No!" she said. Her voice was not a whisper. It was clear and ringing. She walked to the edge of the porch railing. She looked straight at Harlan Graves. "You want the truth?" she called out. "I will tell you the truth." Graves blinked, surprised by her boldness. "Shut your mouth, woman." "I will not," Clara said. She looked at the sheriff, then at the hired guns, then at her own ranch hands. "I signed that paper. Yes, I signed it because my husband had been dead for 2 months, and I had not eaten in 3 days. I signed it because Mr. Sterling told me he would take the bed I slept in if I didn't pay him." "That is business," Sterling squeaked. "And you?" Clara turned her gaze on Graves. "You met me in the alley. You told me you had work. And when I asked what kind, you backed me against the wall and put your hands on me. You told me I could start paying right there, in the dirt." A murmur went through the ranch hands. Even the sheriff looked uncomfortable. "You are a liar," Graves roared, his face turning purple. "I am not," Clara cried, her voice shaking with the force of her adrenaline. "I ran from you. I ran until I fell in the snow. I would rather have frozen to death than let you touch me again. Mr. Caldwell did not conspire to anything. He saved a woman you were trying to hunt down like an animal. He married me to give me the dignity you tried to steal." She stood there, chest heaving, tears of fury standing in her eyes. She had stripped herself bare. She had confessed her darkest desperation to the men who worked for her husband. "She speaks the truth," Ethan said, his voice deep and resonant. "I saw the bruises on her arm where you grabbed her, Graves, and I saw the contract. It is unlawful coercion. Judge Holloway will not just throw it out, he will have you jailed for it." Sheriff Brody looked at Graves. He looked at the determined set of Ethan's jaw. He looked at the ranch hands, who were now glaring at Graves with open hostility. The narrative had shifted. This wasn't a business dispute. It was a predation. "Harlan," Brody said slowly, "maybe we should rethink this." "Rethink," Graves screamed. "I paid for her. She is mine." He was losing control. He saw the disgust in the eyes of the men around him. He saw his prize slipping away. "Damn you all!" Graves shrieked. He reached into his coat. "Drop it!" Ethan shouted, bringing the rifle up. Graves didn't drop it. He pulled a snub-nosed revolver and fired blindly at the porch. Bang! The sound shattered the afternoon. Ethan jerked back, spinning halfway around. A patch of red bloomed on his left shoulder. "Ethan!" Clara screamed. Chaos erupted. "Get down!" Dutch roared. The ranch hands opened fire. The hired guns, realizing they were in a losing fight for a man who had just shot a prominent rancher, hesitated. But Graves fired again, wild and desperate. Ethan dropped to one knee, clutching his shoulder. He tried to raise his rifle with one arm, but the pain was blinding. Graves was aiming again, right at Ethan's chest. Clara did not think. She did not freeze. She lunged. She grabbed Ethan by the back of his vest and hauled him backward with a strength she did not know she possessed. "Move!" she screamed at him. She dragged him behind the heavy oak water trough that sat on the porch. Wood splinters flew as a bullet struck the rim of the trough inches from her face. "Stay down!" Clara yelled, pressing her hands to Ethan's bleeding shoulder. Ethan looked up at her, dazed. This was not the trembling woman who hid in the bedroom. This was a lioness. Her eyes were fierce, her jaw set. "Dutch!" Clara shouted over the gunfire. "Flank them on the left! Red, get the horses!" The men obeyed her instantly. In the yard, Sheriff Brody had seen enough. Graves had fired first. He had shot a man in front of the law. "Cease fire!" Brody bellowed, drawing his own gun and leveling it at Graves. "Drop it, Harlan, or I will put you down!" Graves froze. He looked around. His hired men had their hands in the air. The ranch hands had rifles trained on his chest. The sheriff was aiming at his head. Slowly, the madness faded from his eyes, replaced by the cold realization of ruin. He dropped the revolver into the mud. "Check him," Brody ordered the deputies. "Get him off that horse and cuff him. Attempted murder, and whatever else the judge wants to tack on." The shooting stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the heavy breathing of men and the snorting of spooked horses. On the porch, behind the trough, Clara sagged. The adrenaline dumped out of her system, leaving her trembling. She looked down at her hands. They were covered in Ethan's blood, fresh blood, mixed with the dust of the fight. Ethan reached up with his good hand and touched her face. "Clara," he breathed. She looked at him. I yelled at Dutch." "You did," Ethan rasped, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "You saved my life." The aftermath was a blur of grim efficiency. Sheriff Brody, eager to salvage his own reputation, was apologetic as he hauled Graves away in the back of the wagon. The hired guns were disarmed and sent packing with a warning never to return to the territory. The ranch hands moved with a subdued respect. They looked at Clara differently now. She wasn't just the boss's wife. She was the woman who had stared down a gun and dragged the boss to safety. She was Iron Creek. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in bloody streaks of orange and violet, Clara helped Ethan into the bedroom. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of his shoulder. It was painful and bloody, but it had missed the bone and the lung. Clara lit the lamp. She filled a basin with warm water and mixed in a tincture of echinacea and yarrow. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, shirtless. His chest heaved with pain, sweat slicking his skin. The bandage on his head from the fall was stained, and the new wound on his shoulder oozed sluggishly. "This will sting," Clara murmured, dipping the cloth. "I know," Ethan grunted. She stepped between his knees to reach the wound. She began to wash the blood away, her movements gentle and rhythmic. The water turned pink in the bowl. The room was quiet, intimate in a way it had never been before. The barriers of the day, the violence, the shouting, the fear, had been stripped away, leaving only the two of them in the circle of lamplight. Clara focused on his skin. It was hot to the touch. She traced the line of his collarbone with the cloth, cleaning the soot and dust. She felt the hard ridge of muscle beneath. She realized her hands were not shaking. She was touching him, bare skin, intimate proximity, and she was not afraid. She looked at his face. Ethan was watching her. His eyes were dark, dilated with pain, but also with something else. He was looking at her mouth. He was looking at the rise and fall of her chest. A strange sensation unfurled in Clara's stomach. It started low and radiated outward. A tightening, a heat. She remembered the way he had looked at her on the porch, the way he had tried to shield her. She leaned in closer to bandage the shoulder. Her breast brushed against his uninjured arm. Ethan drew a sharp breath. He did not pull away. Clara paused. She could feel the heat of him radiating through her dress. She looked at his lips. She remembered the kiss in the study, the panic she had felt then. But now? The thought of his mouth on hers did not make her want to run. It made her knees weak, but in a way that made her want to lean closer. It was terrifying. Yes, but it was a thrill. It was the edge of a cliff. And for the first time, she wondered what it would be like to jump. "Clara," Ethan whispered, his voice rough. "You should stop." "Is the bandage too tight?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "No," he said, "but if you keep standing this close, I am going to forget that I am bleeding." Clara didn't move back. She looked him in the eye. The air between them crackled, heavy with the scent of blood, soap, and unspoken desire. "Maybe," she whispered, shocking herself. "Maybe I don't want you to remember." She finished the knot on the bandage and stepped back, her face flushing crimson. She picked up the basin and turned away quickly, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, not in fear, but in a wild, confusing anticipation of what might come next. The days following the shootout at Iron Creek moved with a slow, heavy rhythm, measured not by the clock, but by the changing of bandages and the arc of the sun across the bedroom floor. Ethan's recovery was steady, though the wound in his shoulder was deep and the bruising on his ribs made every breath a labor. For the first time in his life, the master of the ranch was confined to the four walls of his home, dependent on the very woman he had sworn to protect. Clara did not shrink from the task. The violence on the porch had broken something open inside her, releasing a reservoir of strength she hadn't known existed. She took over the management of the household with a quiet, fierce efficiency. She directed Mrs. Gable on which herbs to steep for the infection. She ordered Dutch to keep the men close to the bunkhouse in case Graves's associates returned, and she spent every other waking hour at Ethan's bedside. The physical distance that had defined their marriage evaporated in the heat of the sick room. There was no room for modesty when a fever needed to be broken or a dressing needed to be changed. Clara washed his chest with cool water, her hands moving over the hard planes of muscle and the jagged scars of his past. She supported his weight when he needed to sit up, his heavy arm draped over her shoulders, his breath warm against her neck. At first, the intimacy was purely practical, born of necessity. But as the fever broke and Ethan's eyes cleared, the air in the room began to change. One afternoon, Clara was rewrapping his shoulder. Ethan was sitting on the edge of the bed, his shirt discarded. The afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains, casting patterns on the floorboards. "Is it healing?" Ethan asked, his voice rough with sleep. "The redness is gone," Clara murmured, her fingers brushing the skin near his neck. "You were lucky. Ethan, an inch lower and it would have shattered the bone." "I have always been lucky," he said, turning his head slightly. His movement brought his face inches from her hand. He stopped there, not pulling away. Clara stilled. She could feel the heat radiating from him. She looked down and saw him watching her, his gray eyes dark and unguarded. For a moment, neither of them breathed. Her hand lingered on his good shoulder, her thumb tracing the line of his collarbone unconsciously. A loose lock of her hair fell forward, brushing against his bare chest, and she saw his skin shiver in response. She pulled back quickly, her heart hammering. I should fetch your broth." "Clara," he said, reaching out to catch her wrist. His grip was weak, but she stopped instantly. "Stay, please." She sat in the chair beside the bed, smoothing her apron, trying to calm the sudden, confusing riot in her blood. 3 evenings later, the weather turned. The relentless wind died down, leaving a silence that felt vast and holy. The sun began to dip behind the western ridges, painting the sky in bruised purples and streaks of burning orange. Ethan was sitting up in the armchair by the window, a blanket draped over his legs. He had insisted on getting out of bed, claiming the mattress was softening his spine. Clara sat opposite him, mending a tear in his vest. "I owe you an apology," Ethan said suddenly into the quiet. Clara looked up, needle poised. "For getting shot? I believe I have already scolded you for that." "No," Ethan said. He looked out at the darkening hills, his profile sharp and serious. For the frustration I showed you, for the nights I spent in the bunkhouse." Clara lowered the vest. "Ethan, you were patient. I was the one who—" "I wanted you," he interrupted, turning to look at her. The raw honesty in his voice stopped her breath. "From the first moment I saw you in the snow, I wanted you. And when I brought you here, and you were so terrified, I hated myself for it. I felt like a monster for desiring a woman who flinched when I walked into a room." He rubbed a hand over his face, looking suddenly older. "I thought if I stayed away, if I kept a wall between us, I could protect you from it, from me." Clara set her sewing aside. She moved to the ottoman at his feet, looking up at him. "You were protecting me from more than that, weren't you?" Ethan looked at her, startled by her insight. He hesitated, then let out a long sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years. "Sarah," he said, the name falling heavily into the room. She was full of life, fearless. She laughed at storms. When she died, when I found her frozen, I didn't just lose her. I lost my belief that I was a good man. I swore I would never build a home again. I swore I would never be responsible for a life I might fail to save." He looked at his injured shoulder, then back to Clara. "And then I found you, and you were so fragile. Clara, I was terrified that I would break you, or that the world would break you because of me. And I nearly did. I brought Graves to your door. You stood between him and me," Clara said softly. She reached out and took his large, rough hand in both of hers. "You took a bullet for me." "I would take 10, he said intensely. Clara looked down at their joined hands. His were calloused, scarred, capable of violence. Yet they lay dormant and gentle in hers. She thought of Thomas. She thought of the smell of whiskey and the sound of a belt snapping leather. "I need to tell you," she whispered. "I need you to know why I am the way I am." "You don't have to," Ethan said gently. "I do," she insisted. She took a breath, her voice shaking. "Thomas, he wasn't just mean. He enjoyed it. He liked the fear. He made me feel small, not just in size, but in spirit. He told me my body was a burden, a thing to be used and pushed aside." She looked up at Ethan, tears standing in her eyes. "I learned to dread the weight of a man. I learned that desire is just another word for taking. When you kissed me in the study, I didn't see you. I saw him. I felt him crushing me." She waited for the look of disgust, The male pride wounded by the comparison. But Ethan's eyes filled only with a deep, aching empathy. He lifted his hand and cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. "I am not him," Ethan whispered. "And I will spend the rest of my life proving that to you." "I know," Clara said, leaning into his palm. "I know that now. We are a pair, aren't we? You with your guilt, and me with my fear." "Two damaged people," Ethan agreed, a faint smile touching his lips. "Trying to survive the winter." "The winter is over, Ethan," Clara said. She stood up and kissed his forehead. It was a chaste kiss, but it lingered. "Let me help you back to bed." That night, a spring storm rolled in from the plains. It was not the blizzard of their meeting, but a warm, boisterous storm, with thunder that rumbled deep in the earth and rain that lashed against the eaves. They lay in the big walnut bed. The lamp was out. The room was filled with the gray light of the storm. Ethan lay on his back, careful of his shoulder. Clara lay on her side, facing him, watching the rise and fall of his chest. The thunder grumbled, low and long. Usually, Clara would have flinched. But tonight, with the confession of the evening still hanging in the air, the sound felt distant. She looked at the space between them. It was only inches, yet it felt like a canyon she had been too afraid to cross. "I don't want to be ruled by fear anymore," she thought. "He nearly died. We could have lost this." Her heart began to race, not with terror, but with a sudden, desperate courage. She moved. She slid her hand across the cool sheet until her fingers brushed his arm. Ethan went still. "Clara?" he whispered into the dark. "I am here," she said. Her voice trembled, but she did not pull back. She moved closer, shifting her body until she was pressed against his side, her head resting near his good shoulder. Ethan stopped breathing for a second. "Are you sure?" "I don't want to be afraid," she whispered against his skin. "I want to be your wife. Ethan, not just on paper, not just in the kitchen. I want to be with you." "Clara," he groaned, turning his head to press a kiss into her hair. "If we cross this line, I don't know if I can go back to sleeping on the edge of the bed. I don't want to frighten you." "Then don't," she said. She lifted her head, finding his face in the dark. "Go slow. Let me find my way." He turned carefully onto his side, facing her. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing her lower lip. He kissed her. It was not the hungry, desperate kiss of the study. It was slow, tender, asking a question with every brush of his lips. Clara trembled, her body remembering old pains, old instincts to freeze. But Ethan was not crushing her. He was waiting. She kissed him back, parting her lips. He moved closer, his hand sliding down her back, warm and heavy. He was big, so much larger than she was, and for a moment, panic flared as she felt the sheer mass of him shifting. "Wait," she gasped, pulling back slightly. Ethan stopped instantly. "I've stopped. I'm right here." "It's just—" She flushed in the darkness, grateful he couldn't see her face. "You are so big, and I am not used to kindness there. I will be gentle," he promised, his voice a low rumble that vibrated against her chest. "I will not hurt you." She guided his hand. She let him touch her, flinching at first, then relaxing as his touch remained reverent. He murmured to her constantly, a stream of soft praises and reassurances that drowned out the thunder outside. But when the moment came, when the physical reality of the act presented itself, Clara froze again. The memory of pain was a physical barrier. She felt small, fragile, and terrified of the invasion. "I can't," she whimpered, hiding her face in his neck. "Ethan, I can't. It won't work. It's too much." Ethan held her, stroking her hair. He didn't push. He didn't pull away in frustration. "It's all right," he soothed. "We have all night. We have all our lives." "But it is—" She struggled for the words, humiliated by her own anatomy and fear. "It is too big. Just sit on it?" The words tumbled out, clumsy and desperate. She had heard a washerwoman say it once, A crude piece of advice for a nervous bride, and in her panic, it was the only solution her mind could grasp to keep control, to keep from being pinned down. Ethan went still. Then, a low, soft sound rumbled in his chest. It wasn't mocking. It was a sound of understanding. "If that makes you feel safe," he whispered against her ear, "then you lead. You set the pace. I won't move unless you want me to." He helped her, guiding her with hands that were shaking with his own restraint. He let her take the high ground, let her control the depth and the weight. It was awkward at first, filled with her sharp intakes of breath and his soothing whispers. But as she realized he was true to his word, that he was holding still, letting her dictate the rhythm, the fear began to bleed away. She looked down at him in the dim light. His head was thrown back, his eyes closed, his face open and vulnerable in a way she had never seen. He was surrendering his strength to her. Tears pricked her eyes, but then a small, watery laugh escaped her. She was doing it. She was here, and the world wasn't ending. The pain was a distant echo, replaced by a fullness, a connection that felt like an anchor dropping into the seabed. "Ethan," she sighed, collapsing forward to rest her forehead against his. "I have you," he breathed, wrapping his good arm around her, holding her close. "I have you. Clara." They lay there as the storm passed, limbs tangled, hearts beating in a slow, synchronized rhythm. There was no shame in the room anymore, only the smell of rain and the profound, exhausted peace of a war finally ended. The change in the house over the next few weeks was subtle, like the shift of light in the turning of a season. There were no grand declarations, but there was a new ease in the way they moved around each other. They shared private smiles over the rim of coffee cups at breakfast. When Ethan walked through the kitchen, his hand would graze the small of her back, a casual claim that made Clara flush with pleasure rather than fear. In the barn, between chores, he would pull her into the shadows for a brief, fierce embrace, burying his face in her neck as if drawing strength from her scent. The town, too, began to shift. The arrest of Harlan Graves had broken a dam. The circuit judge, upon returning and hearing the testimony of the sheriff and the ranch hands, had not only voided the contract but had Graves held over for trial in the territorial capital. The story of Clara standing on the porch, unarmed, defending her wounded husband, had spread like wildfire. She was no longer the saloon girl widow. She was the Iron Creek bride. On a Sunday in June, Ethan hitched the buggy. "Get your hat," he told her. "We are going to church." Clara hesitated. "Ethan, the staring—" "Let them stare," he said, helping her up. "Let them see." When they walked into the church, the congregation went silent. Clara held her head high, her hand tucked firmly into the crook of Ethan's arm. She wore a dress of sprigged muslin she had made herself, and the gold ring on her finger caught the light. They walked down the aisle to the Caldwell pew near the front. As they passed Mrs. Higgins, the woman looked ready to look away, but then, catching Ethan's hard stare, she offered a stiff, polite nod. "Good morning, Mrs. Caldwell," the baker's wife whispered as they passed. Clara squeezed Ethan's arm. It was a small victory, one with blood and courage, but it tasted sweeter than any wine. Summer burned across the prairie, turning the grass to gold. The work was hard, long days of haying, branding, and dust. But the ranch no longer felt like a fortress against the world. It felt like a home. Clara planted hollyhocks along the path to the porch. She put a rocking chair out front, where she would sit in the evenings, watching the fireflies dance over the creek. In late August, the heat broke with a series of cool mornings. It was then that Clara realized the rhythm of her own body had changed. She sat on the edge of the bed one morning, counting the weeks in her head. Fear, cold and familiar, washed over her first. She remembered the pain of her first labor. She remembered the silence of the room when the baby didn't cry. What if I lose this one too? But then she looked out the window. She saw Ethan down by the corral, breaking a new colt. He was patient, gentle, talking to the animal with low, soothing words. She was not alone this time. That evening, after supper, she found him on the porch. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. "Ethan," she said, stepping out to stand beside him. He put an arm around her waist, pulling her into his side. "Tired?" "A little," she said. She rested her head on his shoulder. "Ethan, I am late." He went still. "Late?" "With my courses," she whispered. I think I am with child." Ethan pulled back to look at her. His face went slack with shock. He stared at her stomach, then up at her eyes. For a second, she saw the old terror in his gaze, the fear of loss, the memory of Sarah, the belief that he was cursed. "A baby?" he rasped. "Yes," Clara said, taking his hand and placing it on her waist. "Your baby?" Ethan's eyes filled with tears. His throat worked as he tried to swallow past the lump of emotion. He looked at the vast, dangerous landscape around them, then back at the woman who had survived it all. "I will keep you safe," he choked out. "Both of you, I swear it." "I know." Clara smiled, tears spilling down her own cheeks. "We will be all right, Ethan. We are going to be happy." He pulled her into a crushing hug, burying his face in her hair, shaking with a joy he had thought dead and buried. They stood there as the stars came out, two lonely people who had dared to gamble on love and won. Epilogue. The snow came again, as it always did. But the Iron Creek Ranch was ready. The fire in the great room roared, casting a warm glow over the rug. Outside, the wind howled, searching for a crack to enter, but the walls held fast. Clara sat in the rocking chair, a bundle of flannel in her arms. She looked down at the sleeping face of their son, Samuel. He had Ethan's dark hair and her chin. He was warm, solid, and undeniably alive. The door opened, and Ethan came in, stomping snow from his boots. He looked older, the gray at his temples spreading, lines of fatigue around his eyes. But when he saw them, his face transformed. The hardness melted away, replaced by a look of pure, unguarded adoration. He hung up his coat and walked over, kneeling beside the chair. He reached out a large, calloused finger and stroked the baby's cheek. "Is he sleeping?" Ethan whispered. "Finally," Clara said softly. Ethan leaned his head against Clara's arm, closing his eyes, listening to the steady breathing of his wife and son. "Too big," he teased gently, looking up at her with a smirk that made him look 10 years younger. Clara laughed, a sound that was free of all shadows. She leaned down and kissed him. "Just right," she whispered. Outside, the west was wide and wild, full of dangers and storms that would never truly end. But here, in the circle of the firelight, they had carved out a peace that nothing could touch, a love that carried scars, yes, but shone fiercely enough to light the way home. "Thank you so much for listening to this story. Too big. Just sit on it," the rich rancher whispered to the young widow who was terrified of. It has been a journey walking the dusty roads of Iron Creek with Clara and Ethan, watching them heal from their pasts to build a future together. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from. I am always amazed to see how far these western winds blow. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of love, resilience, and the American frontier, please consider subscribing to From Wild West. Share your thoughts in English in the comments. Did Clara's courage surprise you? Did Ethan's redemption touch your heart? I read every comment and appreciate your support. Until the next story, keep your fires burning bright